The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Clara Byrne had always considered the unluckiest day of the week. Not Monday, because Monday had the decency to announce itself as miserable. Not Wednesday, because Wednesday was already halfway to freedom. Tuesday was the traitor. Tuesday pretended to be ordinary, and then caught you with your guard down. She was standing in the scullery of the Hargrove residence in Shropshire, elbow deep in cold dishwater, when the cook handed her the envelope without looking up from her pastry dough. "Post for you, girl." Clara dried one hand on her apron and took the letter. The paper was thick, cream-colored, the kind that cost more than her weekly wages. The seal on the back was dark red wax, pressed with an image she did not recognize. Some kind of bird, an eagle maybe, or a hawk, something with talons. She broke the seal and read the letter twice, because the first time through, the words did not make sense. The second time, they still did not make sense, but they also made her heart beat in a way that felt like running. Ashworth Manor, Derbyshire. Upstairs maid position. Room and board provided. References accepted upon arrival. Start date, the 14th of October, 1847. Report to Mrs. Phelps, head housekeeper. Clara had sent that application 3 weeks ago, during the dark, panicked hours after Mrs. Hargrove had informed her, with a mouth as tight as a stitched wound, that her services would no longer be required. The curtain incident, the wasp, the candle. Clara still maintained that the wasp had been the size of a small dog, but no one was interested in her version of events. She had fired off applications to 9 houses, using references from the one employer who still tolerated her enough to write a kind word. She had expected nothing from Ashworth Manor. Everyone in domestic service knew about Ashworth Manor. The house where the Duke lived alone, in a grief so thick it had its own weather system. The house where maids lasted 3 months if they were lucky, and 2 weeks if they were not. The house where laughter was treated like a contagious disease. Clara folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, where it sat against her hip like a small, insistent heartbeat for the rest of the day. She left Shropshire on a Thursday morning in a cart that smelled of turnips and wet wool. The driver, a man named George who delivered goods between the counties, talked for the first hour about the weather, the roads, and the declining quality of English cheese. Clara listened and nodded, and watched the landscape change from the soft green of Shropshire to the harder, stonier country of Derbyshire, where the hills rose like the hunched shoulders of old men. "You going to Ashworth, then?" George asked, when the road narrowed and the trees thickened. "I am." George made a sound in his throat, the kind of sound people make when they know something they wish they did not. "Good luck to you, miss. The last girl that went there came back in a fortnight. Said the house was like living inside a held breath. Said she never heard a single voice above a whisper the whole time she was there." Clara looked at her hands in her lap. They were red from dishwater and rough from scrubbing, and there was a small scar on her left thumb, from the time she had tried to open a tin of sardines with a letter opener. She was not the kind of woman who frightened easily. She was the kind of woman who frightened other people, mostly by accident, mostly by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong amount of enthusiasm.
"I can whisper,"
she said. George gave her a look that suggested he doubted this very much. Ashworth Manor appeared through the trees, like a thing that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Gray stone, dark windows, ivy, climbing the east wall with the slow determination of something that had been climbing for 100 years and intended to climb for 100 more. The house was enormous, in the way that only English country estates can be enormous, not tall so much as wide, spread across the land like an animal that has lain down and refused to get up. Clara climbed down from the cart, collected her single bag, and stood at the foot of the gravel drive, while George turned his cart and headed back toward civilization. The crunch of his wheels faded. The silence that replaced it was not the ordinary silence of the countryside, filled with birds and wind and the secret industry of insects. This was a manufactured silence, a silence that had been built and maintained and defended over years. Clara picked up her bag and walked toward the servants' entrance at the side of the house. Her shoes crunched on the gravel, and the sound seemed offensive, an intrusion, as though the stones themselves were asking her to tread more carefully. The door was opened by a woman who looked as though she had been assembled from the same stone as the house. Mrs. Phelps was tall, narrow, gray-haired, and possessed of a jawline that could have been used to cut glass. Her eyes moved over Clara, the way a butcher's eyes move over a side of beef, assessing weight, usefulness, how long the thing would last before it went off. Clara Byrne? Yes, ma'am. You are late. The cart driver stopped for cheese, ma'am. Mrs. Phelps looked at her for a long moment, and Clara could feel herself being weighed against every maid who had come before her, and every maid who would come after. She could feel herself being found wanting. This was a familiar sensation. Clara had spent most of her life being found wanting by people who had decided what they wanted before she had even entered the room. Come in. Leave your bag by the door. Someone will take it to your room. Clara stepped into the servants' corridor, and the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. The walls were stone, the floor was flagstone, and the air smelled of beeswax, lye soap, and something else. Something harder to name. The smell of a house that has stopped being lived in and started being endured. Mrs. Phelps walked ahead with the efficient stride of a woman who had never wasted a step in her life. Clara followed, trying to match her pace, and failing, because Clara's legs were shorter, and her attention was already being pulled in 6 directions by the sheer scale of the house opening up around her. The servants' hall was a long room with a wooden table that could seat 20, and a fireplace large enough to roast a pig. There were hooks on the wall for coats, a clock that ticked with the grim regularity of a metronome, and a notice board covered in schedules and instructions, written in Mrs. Phelps's sharp, angular hand. Sit, Mrs. Phelps said. Clara sat. The rules of this house are simple. I will explain them once. I will not explain them again. Mrs. Phelps stood with her hands clasped in front of her, like a general addressing troops before a battle that everyone expected to lose. The Duke of Granville is the master of this house. He has been in residence for 6 years. During those 6 years, the Duke has not entertained guests. He has not attended social functions. He has not left the estate grounds except on matters of legal necessity. He takes his meals alone in his study. He does not receive visitors. He does not engage in conversation with staff. Clara opened her mouth. Mrs. Phelps raised one finger, and the mouth closed again. You are assigned to the East Wing, which is the Duke's private wing. Your duties are as follows. Fires laid by 6 o'clock each morning. Dusting and polishing completed by 7:30. Linens changed every Monday and Thursday. Tea service placed outside the study door at 9, 1 and 5. You will knock twice to signal the tea has been placed. You will not wait for a response. There will be no response. Mrs. Phelps paused here, and something in her face shifted. Not softened exactly. More like a crack in plaster that reveals the lathe beneath. You will not speak to the Duke unless he speaks to you first. The Duke will not speak to you. This is not cruelty, Miss Byrne. This is the way the house runs. The Duke has his reasons, and those reasons are not your concern. Clara nodded. She wanted to ask what those reasons were. She wanted to ask about the silence, the solitude, the 6 years. She wanted to ask why a man who owned 600 acres of Derbyshire and a house with 40 rooms and a staff of 12 chose to live as though he were the last person on earth. She did not ask. She was learning. One more thing, Mrs. Phelps said. She stepped forward and gripped Clara's wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to communicate something that words alone could not. You will not be seen. You will not be heard. You will clean as though you were never there. If the Duke is in a room, you leave it. If the Duke is approaching a room, you leave it faster. Am I understood? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Phelps released her wrist. Clara stood and turned toward the door. Her hip caught the edge of the table. The impact traveled down the table's length like a wave and reached a small porcelain shepherdess sitting on a shelf behind the head chair. The shepherdess wobbled. Clara lunged for it. Her fingers closed on air. The shepherdess hit the flagstone floor and became 4 separate pieces, each one sliding in a different direction, as though they were all trying to escape. The silence that followed was of a quality Clara had never experienced before. It was the silence of a house that had been expecting this exact thing and was now confirmed in its worst suspicions. Mrs. Phelps looked at the pieces on the floor. She looked at Clara. She closed her eyes. Clara dropped to her knees and began gathering the fragments. I can fix it, she said. I am quite good with glue. I once repaired a gravy boat that had been in 7 pieces, and you could barely see the seams unless you held it up to the light and squinted, and even then. Stop talking. Clara stopped talking. Mrs. Phelps opened her eyes. Your room is at the top of the back stairs, third door on the left. Supper is at 8:30. You will begin your duties tomorrow at 5. Clara gathered the porcelain fragments into her apron, stood, and walked to the door with the exaggerated care of a woman crossing a frozen pond. She made it through the doorframe without touching either side. She considered this a victory. Her room was the size of a generous closet, a narrow bed with a wool blanket, a washstand with a chipped basin, a hook on the back of the door for her coat, and a small window that looked out over the kitchen garden. The walls were whitewashed. The floor was bare boards. There was no mirror, which Clara considered a mercy, because she was fairly certain she looked like something the cat had dragged in, argued with, and then abandoned. She sat on the bed and took the letter from her apron pocket. The cream-colored paper with the red wax seal. She held it and felt the weight of it, and thought about what George the cart driver had said, like living inside a held breath. Clara put the letter under her pillow, lay down, and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked in a pattern that looked, if she squinted, like a map of somewhere she had never been. She traced the cracks with her eyes, and tried to imagine the man who lived in the east wing of this enormous, silent house. A man who had not spoken to his own staff in 6 years. A man whose grief was so large it had its own rooms, its own schedule, its own rules. She thought about grief. She knew something about it, though her version was smaller, quieter, the kind that polite people do not talk about. Her father had died when she was 17, the parish clerk with the terrible singing voice and the habit of reading aloud from whatever book he happened to be holding, whether anyone was listening or not. He had read Shakespeare to the chickens. He had read sermons to the kitchen table. He had read fairy tales to Clara every night until she was too old for fairy tales, and then he had read them anyway, because he said the stories did not know she had grown up, and it would be rude to tell them. He died on a Tuesday. Of course he did. Clara's mother had followed him 18 months later, not from illness but from something quieter, something the doctor called a weakening of the constitution, but which Clara knew was simply the slow, methodical process of a woman who had decided that the world without her husband was not a world she cared to navigate. Clara had been left with 3 older sisters who had all married and moved to different corners of England, and a set of skills that included reading, basic arithmetic, a passable hand at needlework, and an extraordinary talent for breaking things. She closed her eyes. The house creaked around her, the way old houses do at night, settling into its bones, adjusting to the weight of one more body within its walls. She wondered if the Duke could feel it too, 3 floors below and a whole wing away, the subtle shift of a house acknowledging a new presence. She fell asleep with her boots still on. She woke at 4:30 to the sound of the kitchen maid lighting the range 2 floors below, a distant clatter of iron and coal that rose through the house like a pulse. Her first morning. Clara dressed in the dark, fumbling with buttons, stepping into her shoes with the graceless urgency of someone who has overslept even when they have not. She found the east wing by following the corridor past the main staircase, past a gallery of portraits whose eyes followed her with the resigned patience of people who have been watching servants get lost in this house for 200 years, and through a heavy oak door that separated the Duke's wing from the rest of the house. The east wing was different, quieter, if such a thing were possible. The carpets were thicker, the walls were paneled in dark wood, the air was colder and smelled faintly of smoke and old paper, and something else, something sweet and faded, like flowers that had been pressed between the pages of a book and forgotten. Clara found the study first, a large room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a small boat, and windows that looked out over the east gardens, which were overgrown in a way that suggested they had once been beautiful and were now in the process of returning to the wild. There was a fireplace with a grate that had not been cleaned. There was an oil lamp on the desk. The glass chimney smoked dark with use. There were papers stacked in precise columns, each stack weighted down with a different object: a glass paperweight, a brass compass, a stone that was smooth and pale and looked like it had been collected from a riverbed by someone who thought it was worth keeping. Clara knelt at the fireplace and began to lay the fire. Kindling first, then coal, then a single match struck against the grate. The flame caught and grew and threw orange light across the room, and for a moment, the study looked almost warm, almost alive, almost like a place where a living person spent their days. She dusted the shelves. She polished the desk. She emptied the grate of yesterday's ash and carried it downstairs in a bucket, soot smudging her cuffs and the bridge of her nose. She returned and laid the tea tray outside the study door. 1 cup, 1 saucer, 1 pot of tea, 1 small jug of milk, 2 lumps of sugar in a bowl. She knocked twice. She did not wait. She cleaned 3 bedrooms that showed no sign of being slept in, a dressing room where suits hung in a wardrobe like the shed skins of a man who no longer needed to be anyone, and a small sitting room where a piano stood against the wall, with its lid closed, and a fine layer of dust on its keys. Clara looked at the piano. She had never played. Her father had tried to teach her once, on the church organ in Shropshire, and she had produced a sound that made the vicar's dog howl and the vicar's wife cross herself. She dusted the piano lid without opening it. She was learning what not to touch. By 7:30, her duties were complete. She had laid fires, dusted, polished, swept, and delivered tea without seeing, hearing, or encountering any sign of the Duke. He was a ghost in his own house, a rumor with a title. She knew he existed only because the tea tray was empty when she returned to collect it, and because the fire in the study had been fed with additional coal, the poker left at a slight angle against the grate. She went downstairs to the servants' hall for breakfast. The other staff were already seated. Harding, the valet, a man in his 50s with the posture of a soldier and the expression of someone who had seen things he would prefer to forget. Mrs. Phelps, at the head of the table. A cook named Mrs. Geddes, round and red-faced and perpetually dusted with flour. A kitchen maid named Polly, who could not have been older than 15. 2 footmen whose names Clara learned were Arthur and Simon. A gardener named Harold who ate with his hat on and spoke to no one. Clara sat at the far end of the table and ate her porridge and toast in silence, which was an achievement of such magnitude that she was privately astonished by it. She was not a quiet eater. She was not a quiet anything. Her natural state was noise, sound, the constant, low-grade hum of a person who processes the world by talking to it. But the house demanded silence, and Clara was trying. She was trying so hard that her jaw ached from keeping it shut. After breakfast, she returned to the east wing to collect the tea tray. She climbed the stairs, turned the corner into the corridor, and stopped. The study door was open. In 3 days of working at Ashworth Manor, she had never seen the study door open. She approached it the way one approaches a dog of uncertain temperament, slowly, with her hands visible. The room was empty. The Duke was not there, but something was different. On the desk, beside the glass paperweight and the brass compass, there was a piece of paper that had not been there that morning, a note, written in a hand that was precise and controlled, and slightly too small, as though the writer was trying to take up as little space as possible, even on paper. Clara picked it up. The fire was laid with birch this morning. I require oak. Birch is unsuitable. Clara read it twice. She looked at the fireplace, where the remains of her carefully laid birchwood fire were still glowing. She looked at the note again. Oak. He wanted oak. She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket, beside the letter that had brought her here, and went downstairs to find the woodpile. She did not know it yet. She could not possibly have known. But that note, those 12 words written in a hand too small for the paper, was the first thread of something that would change the shape of her life, and the shape of his, and the shape of the house that held them both. She found the oak. She stacked it beside the study fireplace for the next morning. She did not leave a note in return. Not yet. But she thought about it. All through the afternoon, all through supper, all through the long, quiet evening in her small room at the top of the back stairs, she thought about a man who would not speak, but who would write. A man who communicated his preferences in notes left on a desk for a maid he had never seen. A man who could tell the difference between birch and oak by the smell of the smoke, and who cared enough about the difference to say so. A man who was, in his own strange and silent way, still paying attention to the world. Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her. Somewhere in the east wing, 3 floors below and a whole corridor away, a fire was burning. Oak, not birch. And a man who had not smiled in 6 years was sitting beside it, watching the flames, and not knowing that the woman who had laid the fire was lying awake and thinking about him. Tuesday, she thought. It had been a Tuesday when the letter came. Maybe Tuesdays were not so unlucky after all. Clara learned the rhythms of Ashworth Manor the way a sailor learns the rhythms of a ship, not through instruction, but through the body, through feet that memorized which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent, through hands that learned which doorknobs turned left and which turned right, through ears that cataloged every sound the house made and filed them into categories: safe, neutral, and warning. The safe sounds were the kitchen, Mrs. Geddes banging pots at dawn, Polly dropping things, because Polly dropped everything, and no one minded, because Polly was 15, and eager, and had a smile that could melt the frost off a window, Arthur and Simon arguing in whispers about cricket scores, the steady, comforting percussion of a household doing its work. The neutral sounds were the house itself, pipes groaning in the walls, wind finding the gaps in the window frames, the clock in the servants' hall, ticking its way through every hour with the same flat patience. The warning sounds were footsteps, specifically, one set of footsteps. The Duke moved through his wing with a particular gait that Clara learned to identify within her first week. Not heavy, not light, deliberate. The footsteps of a man who walked as though he were measuring the distance between where he was and where he needed to be, and finding it always too far. She heard those footsteps, and she moved. That was the rule. If the Duke was approaching, you left. If the Duke was in a room, you were not. Clara became expert at gauging distance by sound, at calculating how many seconds she had between the first creak of the third-floor landing and the Duke's arrival at the study door. The answer was 14 seconds. Enough time to gather her supplies, slip through the service door at the far end of the corridor, and disappear. She was a ghost, cleaning up after a ghost. But the notes continued. After the birch and oak note, 3 days passed in silence. Clara laid the fire with oak. She dusted. She polished. She delivered tea. She did not see the Duke, and the Duke did not write. She began to think the first note had been an exception, a momentary lapse in a man's long commitment to not engaging with the world around him. Then, on the morning of her 8th day, she found a new note on the desk. The shelf behind the door has not been dusted. The green book, third from the left, has been placed spine inward. It faces out. Clara looked at the shelf behind the door. She ran her finger along the top. Dust. Not much, but enough to leave a line on her fingertip. A thin gray accusation. She cleaned the shelf. She found the green book, which was a volume of poetry by someone whose name she did not recognize, and turned it so the spine faced outward. She stood there for a moment, looking at the shelf, thinking about a man who noticed that a single book had been turned the wrong way, who noticed dust on a shelf behind a door, who was paying this much attention to the details of his own space, not because he cared about order, but because order was all he had left. Order was the scaffolding that held up the emptiness, and if the scaffolding shifted, even by one book, the emptiness might rush in. Clara understood this, in a way she could not have explained. She understood it, because she had her own version of it. After her father died, she had organized his books by height. Not by author, not by subject, not by any system that made intellectual sense. By height, because she could control height. She could make the spines form a neat, descending line on the shelf, and that line was a wall between her and the fact that the man who had read those books to chickens was never going to read anything again. She left the study without leaving a note, but she thought about it. The thought sat in her mind like a seed, small and hard and patient. The 9th day changed everything. She was polishing the banister on the second-floor landing. It was 6:30 in the morning, and the light was the pale, uncommitted gray that England does better than anywhere else on earth, the light that refuses to declare itself either day or night, and instead hangs in between, waiting for the world to make up its mind. Clara was humming. She did not realize she was humming until she was already 3 verses into the song, because humming was to Clara what breathing was to other people, involuntary, constant, unstoppable. The song was one her father used to sing, a folk ballad called Barbara Allen, about a young woman who rejects a man who loves her and then dies of grief when he dies of loving her. It was a terrible song, when you thought about it, manipulative and morbid and built on the premise that love is a fatal condition. But the melody was pretty, or it was pretty, when someone with musical ability sang it, and Clara did not have musical ability. Clara had musical ambition, which is a very different and much more dangerous thing. She was humming this song, off-key, with her rag in one hand and a tin of beeswax polish in the other, working her way along the banister toward the newel post at the top of the stairs. She was thinking about the green book on the shelf and whether she should read it, whether that would be overstepping, whether a maid was allowed to be curious about the same poetry her employer cared enough to position correctly on a shelf. She rounded the newel post. He was there. The Duke of Granville was standing at the top of the stairs in yesterday's shirt, which was white linen, untucked, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, in a way that would have scandalized Mrs. Phelps if she had seen it. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His face was the face of a man who had once been considered striking, and was now considered haunted, which is what happens to striking faces when grief moves in and redecorates. He was holding a book he had not been reading. His thumb was between the pages, holding his place out of habit rather than intent, and his eyes were not on the book, or on the stairs, or on Clara. His eyes were on the portrait that hung at the top of the landing. Clara had dusted that portrait every morning. She knew the face in it the way she knew the face of the clock in the servants' hall, by proximity, by repetition, by the accumulated weight of looking at something every day, without knowing its story. The woman in the portrait was young, dark-haired, smiling with the kind of confidence that comes from being loved so completely that doubt has simply packed its bags and left. She wore a blue dress with a high waist and a lace collar, and her hand rested on the arm of a chair, as though she might stand up at any moment and step out of the frame. Clara did not know the woman's name. She did not need to. She knew the portrait hung where the Duke could see it from the top of the stairs, and that was enough. She hit him at full speed. Not full speed in the sense of running. Full speed in the sense of walking with confidence, in a direction she had not checked, and encountering an obstacle she had not expected. Her shoulder connected with his chest. The book flew from his hand and hit the banister with a crack. The tin of beeswax polish left her fingers, hit the marble floor at the base of the stairs, and began to roll. It rolled with intention. It rolled with theatrical commitment. It rolled the way objects roll when they know they are the most interesting thing in the room, and they intend to make the most of it. Clara looked up. The Duke looked down. They were close enough that she could see the individual threads of his shirt collar, the faint shadow of a beard along his jaw, the color of his eyes, which were gray, not the warm gray of a dove's wing or the silver gray of polished metal, the gray of a window in a room where no one has opened the curtains in a very long time, the gray of glass that has stopped expecting light. He smelled of ink and cold tea and oak smoke, which was the fire she had laid for him, which meant she was smelling her own work on his clothes, and this thought made something inside her do a small, confusing flip. "Oh," Clara said. "Oh, Lord! Oh, sir! Oh, I am so sorry, I did not see you. I was polishing, and I was not looking. And your book. I will get your book. And the wax. The wax is still rolling. I can hear it. I am so—" She dropped to her knees to retrieve the book, and the wax tin at the same time, which was geometrically impossible, since the book was on the landing, and the wax tin was somewhere on the stairs below. Her right hand went for the book. Her left hand went for the stairs. Her elbow, which had always operated independently of her brain, caught the Duke's shin. She froze, on her knees, one hand on his book, one hand on the stair rail. Her elbow pressed against the shin of the 6th Duke of Granville, a man she had been explicitly instructed never to be seen by, never to be heard by, and absolutely never to touch. "I am going to stand up now," she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm, and was failing in ways that were almost admirable. "I am going to stand up and give you your book, and collect my polish, and leave, and we can pretend this never happened, and I will write a letter of resignation, if you would like. Or, I can simply throw myself out the nearest window, whichever you prefer. Either option works for me." She stood. She held out the book. Her hand was shaking in a way that she found personally offensive, because Clara Byrne was not a woman who trembled. Clara Byrne was a woman who knocked things over, and set things on fire, and ran into dukes on staircases, but she did not tremble. Trembling was for women in novels, and Clara was not in a novel. Clara was in real life, which was worse, because in real life there was no author to fix things in the next chapter. The Duke took the book. His fingers brushed hers in the transfer, and she felt it the way you feel static from a wool carpet, a small, sharp thing that traveled up her arm and settled somewhere behind her sternum. He did not speak. He looked at her for a moment that lasted either 2 seconds or 2 centuries, and then he turned and walked down the corridor toward his study, carrying his book, leaving Clara standing on the landing with a polishing rag in one hand, and no wax tin, and no dignity, and a heartbeat that was doing something it had no business doing. She stood there until she heard the study door close. Then she sat down on the top step and put her face in her hands and made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan, the sound a person makes when they have done something so spectacularly wrong that the only available response is a kind of horrified amusement. "Brilliant," she whispered into her palms. "Outstanding. Magnificent work, Clara. Truly, your finest hour." She went to find the wax tin. It had rolled all the way to the bottom of the stairs and come to rest against the base of a grandfather clock, as though it had been trying to escape the house entirely, and had been stopped at the last checkpoint. She picked it up. She finished polishing the banister. She laid the tea tray outside the study door at 9 o'clock, knocked twice, and did not wait. But when she came back to collect the tray at 9:30, there was a note on it. "You hum off key. The melody is unrecognizable. What is it?" Clara stared at the note. She read it 3 times. She held it up to the light, as though it might contain a hidden message, a secondary layer of meaning, a clue to what a man who had not spoken to his staff in 6 years was doing writing a question on a tea tray for a maid who had just assaulted him with her elbow. She looked at the study door, closed, silent, the faint smell of oak smoke seeping through the gap at the bottom. Clara took the note downstairs. She sat at the servants' table during the afternoon break and held it in her lap under the table where no one could see it. She read it again. "You hum off key. The melody is unrecognizable. What is it?" He had heard her humming. He had noticed it. He had cared enough to ask. This should not have mattered. He was the Duke. She was the maid. He was asking a simple question about a song, and she was reading it as though it were a letter from the front lines of a war, coded and urgent and full of things that could not be said directly. But it mattered. It mattered because this man had not asked anyone anything in 6 years, and he was asking her. She went back to the study after supper, when she knew the Duke would be in his bedroom, because Harding always brought his evening clothes at 7, and the Duke retired by 8. She found a pencil in the drawer of the hall table. She turned the note over and wrote on the back, in her small, cramped hand, the handwriting of a parish clerk's daughter, who had been taught to write on scraps because paper was expensive. "It is called Barbara Allen, and I hum it perfectly, sir. You may need your hearing examined." She left the note on his desk, beside the glass paperweight, and walked out of the study, with her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the map on the ceiling and thought about what she had done. She had written a note to the Duke. She had been impertinent. She had suggested that a peer of the realm needed his hearing examined. She would be fired. She would be fired and put out on the road, and she would have to go back to Shropshire with her tail between her legs, and her 3 older sisters would say what they always said, which was that Clara's mouth would be the death of her one day. She went to the study at 5:30 the next morning, with the resignation of a condemned woman. She laid the fire, she dusted, she polished. The note was on the desk, a new one, written below her words, in the same small, controlled hand. "My hearing is adequate, your pitch is not. It is, however, the first music in this house in some time." Clara read it. She read it again. She held it against her chest, which was a ridiculous thing to do with a piece of paper, and she knew it was ridiculous, and she did it anyway. "The first music in this house in some time." She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket. She carried it with her all day, through the dusting and the polishing and the fire-laying and the tea delivering, and every now and then she put her hand in her pocket and touched the folded edge of it, just to make sure it was still there. It was still there. The notes became a habit, then a ritual, then a lifeline. He asked what she had read. She told him the truth, which was that she had not read much, because books cost money, and money was a thing she had never had enough of. But she told him about her father, the parish clerk who read Shakespeare to chickens, and she told him that she had inherited his love of stories, if not his library. She told him that she read the books she dusted, opening them to random pages and absorbing them in fragments, so that she knew the middle of things, but not the beginning, the end of things, but not the reason, the climax, but not the context. He found this amusing. She knew, because his next note said, "That is perhaps the most chaotic approach to literature I have ever encountered. It is also, I suspect, more honest than most." She told him she had read the middle of Jane Eyre 4 times, and never the beginning. And 2 days later the book was on the corner of his desk, with a note tucked inside the cover. "Start from the beginning. Return it when finished." Clara took the book to her room and read it by candlelight. She read it in 3 nights, staying up until the candle guttered and died, and then lying in the dark with the story still running behind her eyes, like a river that would not stop. She returned the book with a note inside the front cover. She should have left him the moment she found out about the wife in the attic, but I understand why she did not. That is the worst part. She did not know that Edward read this sentence 7 times. She did not know that he sat at his desk with the book open to her note and traced the shape of her handwriting with his finger, not reading the words but feeling the pressure of the pencil, the slight indentation in the paper where she had pressed too hard on the downstrokes, the way you can feel the ghost of a person in the marks they leave behind. She did not know this, but she felt it, in the way that people sometimes feel things they cannot see, the way you feel someone watching you from across a room, the way you feel rain coming before the first drop falls. She felt that her words were being held by someone who needed them, and this feeling was more terrifying than anything she had ever experienced, because it meant she mattered to someone she could not see, and mattering to someone is the most dangerous thing a person can do. The household was beginning to notice. Not the notes themselves, because Edward was careful, and Clara was careful, and the notes traveled between them like contraband, folded and pocketed, and never left where anyone else could find them. But the changes were visible, small at first. Edward had rung for tea. This was reported by Harding to Mrs. Phelps with the gravity of a man reporting a change in the weather. The Duke had rung the bell that had not been rung in 3 years. Harding had actually forgotten which bell it was and had to check the board in the servants' hall, where the brass indicators hung on their springs, each one labeled with a room: study, bedroom, drawing room, library. Most of them had not moved in so long that they had acquired a thin skin of tarnish. The study bell moved. Harding went up. The Duke asked for fresh tea. 4 words, delivered without looking up from his papers, but 4 words nonetheless. Harding brought the tea, and came downstairs and sat in the servants' hall, and did not speak for 20 minutes, which for Harding was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Then the suits. Edward sent word through Harding that his suits were to be taken to the tailor in the village. All 3 of them. The elbows had gone thin, and the hems had dropped, and the fabric had acquired the weary, defeated look of clothing that has given up hope. Mrs. Phelps received this instruction with the expression of a woman who has been hit over the head with a plank and is deciding whether to fall down or remain standing. She chose to remain standing because Mrs. Phelps always chose to remain standing, and she sent Arthur to the village with the suits that afternoon. Lady Margaret visited on the first Thursday of November. She arrived in a carriage that pulled up to the front entrance with the tentative air of a vehicle that was not sure it would be welcome. Lady Margaret was Edward's younger sister by 4 years, a woman of 30 who had married a barrister in London, and who came to Ashworth Manor every 3 months with the determination of a person visiting a patient in a hospital. She brought news from the city. She brought Edward's favorite biscuits from a shop on Regent Street. She brought hope, which she carried in and carried out again, unused, every time. This visit was different. She could feel it the moment she entered the house. Something in the air had shifted. Not warmed exactly, but stirred, as though a window had been opened somewhere and a breeze was moving through the rooms, disturbing the dust that had settled on everything, the dust of years and silence and stillness. She found Edward in his study, sitting at his desk, reading. He looked up when she entered, and Margaret saw something in his face that she had not seen in 6 years. Presence. He was present. He was in the room, not just occupying it, but inhabiting it, the way a person inhabits a room when they have a reason to be there, beyond the mere fact of having nowhere else to go. "Edward," she said. "Margaret." He stood. He did not embrace her, because Edward did not embrace people. But he stood, and he looked at her, and he said her name, and that was enough. Over tea, which was served in the study by Harding, Margaret probed. She was good at probing. She had married a barrister, and had learned the art of the indirect question, the casual observation that opens a door the other person does not realize they are walking through. "The house seems different," she said. "The carpets were beaten last week." "Not the carpets. The feeling. There is less weight in the air." Edward said nothing. He drank his tea. "Harding tells me you have been eating breakfast." "I have always eaten breakfast." "Harding tells me you have been eating breakfast at the table, not at your desk." Edward set down his cup. "Harding talks too much." "Harding has talked to me exactly once in 6 years, Edward. He came to the front door when I arrived and said, 'Something has changed, my lady.' That is all he said. But Harding is not a man given to overstatement." Edward looked at the fire. Oak. Burning low and steady, the way oak burns, without the crack and spit of birch, without the sweet, sharp smell that reminded him of things he could not afford to remember. "Nothing has changed," he said. Margaret looked at her brother. She did not believe him, but she was wise enough to know that pushing a man who had lived inside himself for 6 years was like pushing a wall. The wall does not move. You simply bruise your hands. She left the following afternoon. She kissed Edward on the cheek, which he permitted, with the stiff tolerance of a man enduring a medical procedure. She climbed into her carriage and sat for a moment before giving the driver the signal to leave. Something had changed. She did not know what, but the window was open, and the air was moving, and for the first time in 6 years, Margaret drove away from Ashworth Manor without crying. Downstairs, in the servants' hall, Clara was eating her supper and trying not to think about the fact that the Duke had a sister who visited him, and a valet who cared about him, and a life that, however diminished, was not empty. It was stripped down. It was bare, but it was not empty, because empty would mean he had stopped caring whether the fire was birch or oak, and he had not stopped caring. She put her hand in her apron pocket. The notes were there, folded small, growing soft from handling. A small archive of a man who was relearning how to reach for someone, one sentence at a time. Clara finished her supper. She washed her plate. She went upstairs to her room and sat on her bed and took out the notes and laid them on the wool blanket in the order they had been written, and read them from beginning to end, as though they were a book. They were a book, she realized. The strangest, smallest, most unexpected book she had ever read. A book with 2 authors who had never been in the same room at the same time. A book written in pencil on scraps of paper, about firewood and music, and a novel with a madwoman in the attic. A book that was not finished. Clara gathered the notes, folded them, and put them back in her pocket. She blew out her candle and lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe around her. Somewhere in the east wing, a man was sitting beside an oak fire, holding a note in his handwriting and a note in hers, and reading them both. November settled over Ashworth Manor like a damp wool coat, heavy and gray, and refusing to be shaken off. The gardens turned brown. The trees in the park stripped themselves bare with the grim efficiency of soldiers surrendering their weapons. Rain came, and kept coming, turning the gravel drive into a river and the east fields into a shallow lake that reflected the sky like a mirror no one had asked for. The burrito was cold. She adapted to winter the way she adapted to everything else, with energy she could not quite control, and a cheerfulness that bordered on the pathological. She wore extra stockings. She carried her polishing rags in a basket instead of a bucket, because the bucket handle gave her chilblains. She discovered that if she positioned herself correctly in front of the study fireplace while laying the fire, she could absorb enough warmth to last her through the corridor and into the next room without her fingers going numb. The notes grew longer. Edward's handwriting, which had started small and controlled, began to loosen. The letters got larger. The sentences stretched. He started asking questions that had nothing to do with housekeeping, and everything to do with the kind of curiosity that comes from being alone for so long that you have forgotten what other people think about. "Do you prefer rain or snow?" Clara wrote back. "Rain. Snow is beautiful, but it makes everything silent. There is already enough silence in this house." She regretted the last sentence immediately after writing it. She stared at it for a full minute, pencil in hand, wondering if she could cross it out and write something less direct, something less honest, something that did not acknowledge the enormous, obvious truth that sat between them, like a third person in every room. She left it. She left it because crossing it out would have been a lie, and the notes were the one place where she did not lie. She lied to Mrs. Phelps every day, Small lies about having dusted shelves she had only glanced at, about having polished silver that she had simply breathed on and wiped with a cloth. She lied to the other servants about why she lingered in the East Wing longer than her duties required. She lied to herself about why she cared so much about a man she had spoken to exactly once, and even then only to apologize for hitting him. But the notes were honest. The notes were the truest conversation she had ever had, and she was having it with a man she had never properly met. Edward's response came the next morning. "You are right, there is enough silence. I have contributed more than my share." That was all. No elaboration. No explanation. No apology, because apologies are for things you plan to change, and Edward was not yet sure he could change. He was sure only that the silence had been noticed, and that the person who noticed it was not afraid to say so. Clara found herself thinking about him at odd hours, while peeling potatoes in the kitchen with Mrs. Geddes, while making her bed in the morning, tucking the wool blanket under the thin mattress, with a precision that had nothing to do with tidiness, and everything to do with having her hands full so her mind would stay empty. While walking in the kitchen garden during her afternoon half-hour of free time, counting the dead heads on the rosemary bushes, and wondering if the Duke ever walked in the garden, if he ever looked out his window and saw the state of the grounds and felt anything about it. She asked him, in a note that she spent 20 minutes composing and 10 minutes staring at, and 3 seconds leaving on his desk before losing her nerve and fleeing the room. "The gardens are in a state, sir. Do you ever walk in them?" His reply, "I used to. Catherine loved the garden. She planted the roses on the south wall. After she died, I could not bear to watch them grow without her, so I stopped watching. The garden, as you say, went to a state." I am aware that this is a metaphor for more than horticulture. Clara read this note 6 times. She held it in her hands and felt the weight of what he was telling her, not just about the garden but about himself. He was aware. He knew what he had become. He knew that the silence and the solitude and the overgrown roses were all symptoms of the same disease, and the disease was grief, and the grief was 6 years old and still growing, like the ivy on the east wall, slow and relentless, and impossible to cut back without cutting into the stone itself. She did not write a comforting reply. She did not write anything soothing or gentle or kind. She wrote, "The rosemary in the kitchen garden is still alive. It does not seem to care whether anyone is watching or not. Perhaps that is the trick." Edward read this and sat very still for a long time. The fire popped, the clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, rain hit the windows with the patient insistence of water that knows it will eventually get in. He wrote, "Perhaps it is." The rosemary note changed something between them. The notes had been careful before, polite, circling each other like two animals meeting in a forest clearing, neither willing to turn its back. Now they leaned in. The questions got braver. The answers got longer. The distance between them, which was measured in corridors and staircases and 100 years of social hierarchy, began to feel less like a wall and more like a curtain. Edward asked about her family. Clara told him about her father, the parish clerk, in more detail than she had told anyone. She told him about the Shakespeare and the chickens. She told him about her mother, who died 18 months after her father, not of illness, but of a decision, a quiet, unspoken decision, to stop being present in a world that no longer contained the person who made it bearable. She wrote, "I do not blame her. I understand her. That is worse than blaming her, because it means I know how it feels to want to stop, and knowing how it feels means I am capable of it, and being capable of it means I have to choose every day not to do it. That is exhausting, sir, but I choose." She left this note on his desk and walked downstairs and sat in the servants' hall and drank a cup of tea that she could not taste, and waited for the world to continue turning, which it did, because the world does not stop for the small, private revelations of maids in apron pockets. Edward's reply was the longest note he had ever written. It covered both sides of the paper, and the handwriting changed halfway through, getting larger and less controlled, as though the hand that was writing was speeding up and could not stop. "I know the choosing. I know it well. For 3 years after Catherine and the child, I did not choose. I simply continued, because continuing is the default state of the living. The body breathes. The heart beats. Food is eaten because it is placed in front of you, and the mechanics of chewing and swallowing do not require consent. But choosing to continue, Actively choosing it, that is different. That requires a reason. I did not have a reason for a long time. The note stopped there, no closing, no sign-off, just the end of the sentence, and then blank paper, as though he had planned to write more and then could not. Clara read it and put it in her pocket and went about her day with the feeling of holding something fragile, something she had been handed without instructions, something that would break if she handled it wrong. She did not write back that day. She did not write back the next day either, not because she did not know what to say, but because what she wanted to say was too large for a note, too large for paper, too large for the narrow, folded, pocketed format that their entire relationship existed within. What she wanted to say was, I will be your reason. Let me be your reason. Not because I am special, or because I am enough, but because I am here, and I am choosing too, and maybe choosing is easier when there are two people doing it. She did not write this. She was a maid. He was a duke. The distance between them was not a curtain, it was a wall, and the wall was made of centuries of accumulated assumption about who was allowed to matter to whom, and in what capacity, and within what boundaries. Instead, on the third day, she wrote, I finished another book from your shelf. The one about the man who sails around the world alone. I think he was not looking for adventure. I think he was looking for a place far enough away from his life that his life could not follow him. But the sea is not far enough. Nothing is far enough. You carry it with you. Edward read this and made a sound. Harding, who was laying out the evening clothes in the dressing room next door, heard it. He could not identify it. It was not a laugh and not a cry. It was something in between, something that has no name, because most people never make it. The sound of a lock turning after so long that the mechanism protests. The sound of something opening that had been sealed shut. The sound of pain and relief occurring simultaneously in the same body. Harding stood very still and listened. Then he returned to the evening clothes and said nothing to anyone, because Harding was a man who understood that some things are private, even from the people who witness them. Clara was beginning to know Edward in the way that readers know characters, not through face-to-face conversation, not through shared meals or shared rooms or shared silences, but through the specific, curated version of himself that he put on paper. She knew his handwriting the way she knew her own. She knew which words he used when he was being careful, and which words he used when he was being honest. She knew that he wrote longer sentences when he was engaged, and shorter sentences when he was retreating. She knew that he never used exclamation marks, and rarely used question marks, and that his periods were heavy, pressed hard into the paper, as though each sentence was a door he was closing behind him. She knew that he read in the evenings, because the books on his desk changed every few days. She knew that he preferred history to fiction, except when the fiction was about the sea, in which case he read it with the desperate attention of a man looking for escape routes. She knew that he drank his tea with milk and one sugar, because the sugar bowl was always one lump lighter when she collected the tray, and the milk jug was always exactly 1/3 emptier. She knew these things the way an archaeologist knows a civilization, through artifacts, through the things left behind. What she did not know, and could not know, was what was happening inside the study when she was not there. She could not know that Edward had begun to wait for her notes, the way a man in a desert waits for water, that he checked his desk first thing in the morning, before the fire, before the tea, looking for the small folded paper in her cramped handwriting, that on the mornings when there was no note, he felt the absence as a physical thing, a hollow space in his chest, that he had to actively talk himself out of interpreting as loss. She could not know that he had started sleeping better, not well, but better, that the dreams about the fire and the nursery door and the sound of Catherine calling his name from a room he could not reach had receded from every night to every third night to once a week, that in the spaces where the nightmares used to be, there was now a kind of silence that was different from the silence of the house, a silence that had room in it, a silence that was waiting to be filled. She could not know that he had gone to the library. The library was the one room in the house that Edward had not entered since Catherine's funeral, not the study, which was his, and not the bedrooms, which were functional, and not the dining room, which he simply did not use. The library was Catherine's room. She had claimed it on their first day in the house, when they were newly married, and the house was new to both of them, and every room was an adventure, a territory to be explored and named, and filled with the specific, personal chaos of two people building a life together. Catherine had read in the green chair by the window. She had sat with her legs tucked beneath her, which was improper for a duchess, and perfect for a wife. And she had read novels that she dog-eared and annotated, and left face down on every surface in the room, so that the library looked less like a library and more like a book had exploded, and the pieces had landed wherever they pleased. After the fire, Edward had closed the library door and locked it. The key was in his desk drawer, beneath a small oil painting that he kept face down, and a knitted sock that was blue and tiny and half-finished, the needles still attached, the wool still connected to a ball that would never get smaller. He did not go to the library. He did not open the drawer. He did not look at the painting or the sock. These were the rules, and the rules were the scaffolding, and the scaffolding was the only thing standing between him and the drop. But on a Thursday in the middle of November, Edward unlocked the library door and went in. The room smelled of dust and old paper, and something fainter, something sweeter, something that might have been the ghost of a perfume worn by a woman who had been dead for 6 years. The green chair was still by the window. The books were still face down on the tables, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed, trapped mid-sentence, in the moment when their reader had put them down for the last time. Edward stood in the doorway and breathed. He did not cry. He had stopped crying 4 years ago, not because the grief had ended, but because the tears had. There is a finite amount of water in a person, and Edward had used his up. What he felt now was not the sharp, cutting pain of early grief, but something duller and heavier, a weight that sat on his chest and pressed down with the patient, unhurried force of something that had no intention of leaving. He walked to the green chair. He touched the armrest. The fabric was cool under his fingers, dusty, the nap worn down in the places where Catherine's hands had rested. He sat down. It was the hardest thing he had done in 6 years, harder than the funeral, harder than the silence, harder than the locked door and the face-down painting and the unfinished sock. Sitting in Catherine's chair was an act of such enormous courage that if anyone had been there to see it, they would not have recognized it as courage, because it looked like a man sitting in a chair. But the distance between standing and sitting, between being in the room and being in the chair, between remembering and inhabiting, that distance was 6 years wide, and Edward crossed it in a single motion, and it nearly broke him. He sat in the chair and looked at the window and saw the garden that Catherine had planted, the roses on the south wall, the rosemary in the kitchen garden, all of it brown and wet and beaten down by November rain, and none of it dead, dormant, waiting. He thought about Clara's note. The rosemary does not care whether anyone is watching. He sat in the chair for an hour, then he stood, left the library, locked the door behind him, and went to his study. He wrote a note. It said, "I went to the library today. I sat in her chair. I thought it would be the end of me. It was not. It was the beginning of something, and I do not yet know what." Clara found the note the next morning. She read it, standing in the study doorway, with the dust rag in her hand, and the winter light coming through the windows, and falling on the desk in long, pale rectangles. She pressed the note against her chest. She closed her eyes. Then she put it in her pocket with the others, picked up the dust rag, and went to work. The collection in her apron pocket was growing. She had started keeping the notes in a small tin box under her bed, a box that had once contained throat lozenges, and now contained the most important correspondence of her life. She arranged them by date, oldest at the bottom, newest on top, and sometimes at night she took them out and read them in order, and it was like reading the diary of a man coming back to life, one sentence at a time. She was aware that this was dangerous, not the notes themselves, but the feeling that accompanied them, the feeling that had started as curiosity and grown into concern and was now becoming something she did not have a name for, something that lived in the space between her ribs and expanded when she thought about him and contracted when she did not, and never, ever went away. She was a maid. He was a duke. She was 23, the daughter of a dead parish clerk, with 2 disastrous employment records and a talent for breaking things. He was the 6th Duke of Granville, a peer of the realm, the owner of 600 acres and a house with 40 rooms, and a grief that would have crushed a lesser man. There was no version of this that ended well. Clara knew this. She was not a fool. She was not a girl in a story who believes that love conquers all, because she had read enough stories to know that love conquers very little, and what it does conquer, it conquers at a cost that is rarely mentioned in the final chapter. But she kept writing. She kept humming off-key in the corridors, knowing he could hear her. She kept laying the fire with oak, and placing the tea tray with 1 cup, and 1 saucer, and 1 pot, and 1 sugar and milk, and she kept folding his notes into her pocket, and carrying them with her, through the long, cold days of a Derbyshire November. She kept choosing. And 3 floors away, in a study that smelled of oak smoke and ink, a man who had not smiled in 6 years was writing a note to a woman he had never properly met, and his hand was steady, and the sentences were getting longer, and the periods were getting lighter, and the doors he was closing behind each sentence were, one by one, being left open. December came to Derbyshire with teeth. The rain turned to sleet, and the sleet turned to frost, and the frost turned the windows of Ashworth Manor into panes of opaque white, as though the house had decided it no longer wanted to see what was outside. Clara woke each morning to a room so cold that her breath made clouds, and the water in her wash basin had a skin of ice that she had to break with her knuckles before she could wash. She moved through the house faster now, not because Mrs. Phelps demanded speed, but because standing still meant freezing. She laid fires like a woman possessed, stacking oak logs and kindling with the focused intensity of someone building a fortress against the cold. She carried extra coal in her pockets. She wore 2 pairs of stockings and a flannel petticoat that she had borrowed from Mrs. Geddes, who was wide enough that her petticoats could have clothed a small family. The notes had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like conversation, if conversation were conducted in slow motion, with 6-hour gaps between sentences, and a desk serving as the medium of exchange. Edward had begun recommending books, not just leaving them on his desk for her to take, but writing small annotations in the margins, tiny penciled comments that she discovered as she read, like finding messages in bottles washed up on the shore of each page. Beside a passage about a ship being caught in a storm, he had written, overwritten, "The sea does not need adjectives." Beside a love scene that Clara found both moving and embarrassing, he had written, "He gets the longing right, the rest is decoration." Beside a description of a man returning home after years away, he had written nothing at all. Just a small mark in the margin, a single vertical line, the smallest possible acknowledgement that the words on the page had landed somewhere inside him. Clara read these annotations with the care of a woman diffusing a bomb. Each one was a window. Each one showed her a piece of the man behind the notes, the man she heard through walls and glimpsed through doorways but had not stood face to face with since the morning on the staircase. She had begun to build an image of him from fragments. The annotations told her he was precise, impatient with excess, drawn to clarity over beauty. The book choices told her he was restless, moving between genres the way a man moves between rooms, looking for something he has not yet found. The notes told her he was lonely, though he would never have used that word, because loneliness implies the desire for company, and Edward would have said he desired nothing. But he desired something. The notes proved it. You do not write to someone you do not want to hear from. You do not ask questions of someone whose answers you do not need. You do not leave a book on a desk with your handwriting in the margins, unless you want the person who reads it to know you better, to come closer, to cross the distance that you have built between yourself and the world. Clara knew all of this, and said none of it, because saying it would have broken the spell, and the spell was fragile, held together by paper and pencil, and the unspoken agreement that neither of them would name what was happening. Then the piano happened. Clara had been dusting the small sitting room on the 2nd floor of the east wing, the room where the piano stood against the wall with its lid closed and its keys untouched. She had dusted the piano every morning for 2 months without opening the lid, because the lid was closed, and closed things in Ashworth Manor stayed closed. That was the rule. The library door was closed, the nursery was closed, the dining room was closed, the drawing room was closed. Closed meant grief lived there, and grief was not to be disturbed. But on this particular morning, the 12th of December, Clara was dusting the piano, and she made a mistake. She was reaching across the top of the instrument to dust the far side, and her sleeve caught the edge of the lid, and lifted it, just an inch, just enough for the lid to lose its balance and fall open with a soft, resonant thud that vibrated through the strings inside, and produced a sound that was not a note, and not a chord, but something in between, a ghost of music, a whisper from an instrument that had forgotten it could speak. Clara froze. The sound hung in the air for a moment, then faded, and the silence rushed back in to fill the space it had left. And the silence was different now, charged, as though the room was holding its breath. She looked at the keys. They were ivory, yellowed with age, covered in a fine layer of dust that her sleeve had disturbed. There were marks in the dust, not new marks, old ones. The ghosts of fingers that had pressed these keys months or years ago. The oils from skin, leaving faint impressions that time had softened but not erased. Catherine had played. Clara knew this without being told. The way she knew many things about the dead wife, whose absence shaped every room in this house. Catherine had played this piano, and the lid had been closed after she died, and no one had opened it since. And now Clara had opened it by accident, and the sound was still echoing somewhere in the walls, traveling through stone and plaster and wood, finding its way to whatever ears might hear it. Clara closed the lid, gently, carefully, with the focus of a woman handling something sacred. She finished dusting the room and left, and went downstairs and ate her breakfast, and said nothing to anyone. That afternoon, there was a note on the desk. The piano in the sitting room. Someone opened it. Clara's stomach dropped. She read the note 3 times, looking for anger, looking for the cold formality that Edward used when he was retreating behind his walls. She did not find it. The note was neutral, a statement of fact, an observation, but beneath the observation was something else, something she could feel but not see, like the vibration of the piano strings still humming in the air, after the lid had fallen open. She wrote back, "It was me, sir. My sleeve caught the lid. I apologize. It will not happen again." His reply came the next morning. "Do not apologize. I heard it from the study. The sound traveled through the wall. I had forgotten what the piano sounded like. It sounded like her." Clara held this note in her hands and felt the enormity of it. 5 sentences. Each one, a door opened into a room she was not supposed to enter. He had heard the piano through the wall. He had recognized the sound. He had connected the sound to Catherine. He had told Clara this. He had trusted her with this. She wanted to write something worthy of his trust, something that honored the weight of what he had shared. She spent the afternoon composing replies in her head, discarding each one as insufficient, too small, too careful, too afraid of the truth. In the end, she wrote, "Should I open the lid again tomorrow?" The answer took 2 days. 2 days, during which Clara laid fires and dusted shelves, and delivered tea, and hummed off-key, and waited with a patience she did not know she possessed. Patience was not her natural state. Clara's natural state was motion, noise, a constant fizzing energy that made her knock things over, and talk too fast, and care too much about things that most people let pass without comment. But she waited. She waited because she understood that the question she had asked was not about a piano lid. It was about permission. Permission to bring sound back into a house that had chosen silence. Permission to disturb the carefully maintained stillness that Edward had built around himself like a fortress, like armor, like a second skin that kept the world from touching the parts of him that were still raw. On the second morning, the note was on the desk. Yes. 1 word, 3 letters, the smallest possible affirmative, and the largest thing Edward had said in 6 years. Clara opened the piano lid that morning. She did not play, because she could not play, because the one time she had attempted a musical instrument, the result had been described by her father as a sound that would make the angels weep, and not from joy. But she opened the lid, and she dusted the keys, and she left it open, and when she came back the next morning, the lid was still open, and there were fresh marks in the dust on the keys. Someone had played. Not a song, not a melody, just a few keys pressed, one at a time, the way a person might press their fingers to a wall to see if it was real. Testing, touching, remembering. Clara dusted around the fresh marks and did not disturb them. The household noticed the open piano the way the household noticed everything, which is to say, through a network of glances and whispers and raised eyebrows that communicated more than any spoken sentence could. Harding told Mrs. Phelps. Mrs. Phelps told no one, but she paused outside the sitting room door the next morning and listened, and what she heard was silence, but it was a different silence, a silence that had a space in it where music might go. Mrs. Geddes, the cook, said nothing about any of it. Because Mrs. Geddes had been at Ashworth Manor for 22 years and had known the Duke and Catherine when they were newlyweds and had baked the cake for the christening that never happened and had stood in the kitchen on the night of the fire and listened to the screams and the breaking of glass and the sound of a man's voice calling a name that would never answer. And Mrs. Geddes had decided long ago that whatever happened in this house, she would remain, and she would cook, and she would not speak of things that were not her business, and that was all. But Mrs. Geddes made Clara an extra portion at supper that night, and when Clara looked up in surprise, the cook gave her a nod that was so small and so brief that it might have been imagined. It was not imagined. It was acknowledged. Whatever Clara was doing in the East Wing, whatever was changing in the weather of that silent house, Mrs. Geddes had noticed it and approved of it and expressed her approval in the only language she trusted, which was food. Clara ate the extra portion and felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Manor, that she was not alone in her project. She did not know what the project was. She did not have a name for it, or a plan for it, or a destination in mind. She was not trying to fix the Duke. She was not trying to save him. She did not believe in saving people, because her mother had taught her, by example, that you cannot save someone who does not choose to be saved. But she could open lids. She could leave notes. She could hum off-key in the corridors and lay fires with oak and read books with annotations in the margins and carry a growing collection of folded paper in her apron pocket and wait, with a patience that surprised her, for whatever came next. What came next was the library. Edward had told her, in a note, that he had gone to the library and sat in Catherine's chair. He had not told her what this meant. He had not told her that the library door was now unlocked, that the key was back in his desk drawer, but the lock was open, that the room was accessible to anyone who turned the handle. Clara discovered this by accident, because Clara discovered most things by accident. She was carrying a stack of clean linens down the second-floor corridor, a stack so tall that she could barely see over the top, navigating by memory and the feel of the carpet under her feet. She had passed the library door 100 times without trying the handle, because closed doors were closed doors and she had learned the rules. But on this morning, her elbow caught the handle, the door swung inward. Clara stumbled, the linens shifted, and she found herself standing in the doorway of a room she had never entered, holding a pile of sheets and looking at a green chair by a window and a collection of books lying face down on every surface. The room was cold. No fire had been laid here. The curtains were open, though, which was new, because Clara had seen them from outside the house, and they had always been drawn. Someone had opened them. Someone had let the light in. Clara put the linens on the floor and stepped into the room. It smelled of dust and paper and old flowers, lavender maybe, dried and faded but still present, trapped in the fabric of the curtains and the upholstery of the chair and the pages of the books. It was a room that had been loved. You could feel it. Not just occupied or used or decorated, but loved, the way some rooms are loved, with the accumulated weight of thousands of hours spent in them, reading and thinking and being present. Clara looked at the books on the tables. She picked one up and read The Spine. It was a novel she did not recognize, by an author she had never heard of. The pages were dog-eared. There were annotations in the margins, but not Edward's handwriting. This handwriting was different, rounder, softer. A woman's handwriting. Catherine's handwriting. Clara opened the book to a dog-eared page and read the annotation. He will regret this, but not yet. 4 words, written in pencil, by a woman who had been dead for 6 years, about a fictional character in a novel that Clara had never read. 4 words that told her more about Catherine than any portrait or any note from Edward ever could. Catherine had been a reader, a close reader, a reader who argued with the text, who predicted and judged and involved herself in the lives of imaginary people with the fierce investment of someone who believed that stories mattered. Clara closed the book and put it back exactly where she had found it, face down on the table. The spine cracked to the page Catherine had been reading when she put it down for the last time. She picked up the linens from the floor and left the library and closed the door behind her and stood in the corridor for a moment, breathing, feeling the weight of what she had seen. She did not tell Edward she had been in the library. Not in a note, not in any way. This was the one thing she kept from him, the one piece of knowledge she held back, because telling him would have meant admitting that she had walked into the most private room in his house, and touched his dead wife's books, and read his dead wife's handwriting, and felt something for a woman she had never met. Something like grief, something like kinship, something like the recognition that comes from seeing, in another person's handwriting, the evidence of a mind that worked the way your own mind works. Reading, annotating, caring too much about people who do not exist. Catherine would have liked Clara. Clara was certain of this, in the irrational, unprovable way that people are certain of things they feel in their bones. Catherine, who read novels with her feet tucked under her, and annotated them in pencil, and predicted the mistakes of fictional men, with a specificity that suggested she had experience with real ones, would have liked the clumsy maid who hummed off-key, and broke things, and wrote impertinent notes to her grieving husband. This thought made Clara's eyes sting. She blinked it away and went back to work. The days grew shorter, the nights grew longer. Clara's candle supply dwindled as she read later and later, working her way through the books Edward left on his desk, each one chosen for her, each one a gift disguised as a recommendation. He gave her a book about a woman who travels across America alone, and Clara stayed up until 2 in the morning, reading about deserts and mountains and wide-open spaces that were the opposite of Ashworth Manor, the opposite of small rooms and closed doors, and the careful, measured footsteps of a man who lived inside his own silence. She wrote in her note, "She goes to all those places, and she is still lonely. Distance does not cure it. I think nothing cures it. I think loneliness is something you learn to carry, like a stone in your pocket that you forget is there until you reach for something else and your hand closes around it instead." Edward wrote back, "You are too young to know this much about loneliness." Clara wrote, "And you are too alive to practice this much of it." She left this note on his desk and went downstairs and sat in the servants' hall and stared at the fire and waited for the regret to come. It came. It always came. The familiar, cold flood of panic that followed every honest thing she wrote, every sentence that crossed the line between servant and human, between polite and personal, between safe and real. But the regret was getting smaller, quieter, less convincing. Each time she wrote something true, and the world did not end, the regret lost a little of its power, the way a bully loses power when you stop running from it and turn around and look at it and say, "Is that all you have?" The next morning, Edward's note was waiting. "You are right. I am too alive. That is the cruelest part of grief. It does not kill you. It leaves you here." And then, below that, in smaller handwriting, as though he was whispering, "But here is becoming more bearable than it was." Clara read this note in the gray December light and put it in her apron pocket with the others, and went to lay the fire, and the fire caught on the first match, and the oak began to burn with its slow, steady heat, and the study filled with warmth, and Clara knelt on the hearth and held her hands to the flames, and felt, for the first time, that the warmth was not just coming from the fire. It was coming from the house, from the man in the house, from the impossible, unnamed, uncategorizable thing that was growing between them, fed by paper and pencil, and the small, stubborn act of writing to someone in the dark, and trusting that they would write back. Christmas arrived at Ashworth Manor the way light arrives at the bottom of a well, slowly, reluctantly, and only because someone above had decided to let it in. The someone was Lady Margaret. She wrote to Mrs. Phelps in the second week of December, announcing her intention to spend Christmas at the manor, and requesting, in language that combined aristocratic courtesy with sisterly steel, that the dining room be opened for Christmas dinner. Not the study, not a tray in front of the fire, the dining room, with the long table and the candelabras and the chairs that had not been sat in since Catherine's last birthday. Mrs. Phelps showed the letter to Harding. Harding showed it to the Duke. The Duke read it and said nothing for a very long time, and then he said something that Harding later described to Mrs. Phelps as unprecedented. He said yes. The house stirred. It was the only word for it. Like a creature waking from a long hibernation, the house stirred. Mrs. Phelps unlocked the dining room and threw open the curtains, and the light that came in was thin and gray and winter pale, but it came in, and it fell on the table and the chairs, and the dust that rose from the cushions when Arthur and Simon beat them, and the dust swirled in the light like something set free. Clara was assigned to help with the preparations. She cleaned the dining room alongside Polly, who chattered the entire time with the breathless enthusiasm of a 15-year-old who has never seen a Christmas dinner table and cannot contain her excitement at the prospect of candelabras. "Will there be a goose?" Polly asked, on her knees scrubbing the floor. Mrs. Geddes said goose. "And pudding?" "Pudding, I expect." "And crackers?" "My mum always had crackers. Paper crowns and little fortunes inside." "Will the Duke wear a paper crown, do you think?" Clara paused in her polishing and considered the image of the 6th Duke of Granville wearing a paper crown. The image was so unlikely, so perfectly absurd, that she felt something in her chest that was either a laugh or a sob, and she could not tell which, and she did not try, because the distinction between laughing and crying had been getting blurrier the longer she lived in this house. "I think the Duke will do whatever the Duke does," Clara said, "which is generally nothing festive." Polly looked disappointed. Clara felt bad. Polly was 15 and had come to Ashworth Manor from a workhouse and had never in her life experienced anything that could be called comfortable, and her capacity for hope was so large and so undamaged that Clara sometimes wanted to wrap it in cloth and put it somewhere safe where the world could not reach it. "But perhaps he will surprise us," Clara added, and Polly's face lit up in a way that made the whole exchange worth it. Margaret arrived on the 23rd of December in a carriage loaded with parcels. She brought gifts for every member of staff, individually wrapped, individually chosen. For Mrs. Phelps, a pair of reading glasses with silver frames. For Mrs. Geddes, a set of copper mixing bowls from a shop in Covent Garden. For Harding, a pocket watch. For Arthur and Simon, new gloves. For Polly, a book of fairy tales, with illustrations so detailed that Polly held it to her chest and did not put it down for 3 hours. For Clara, there was nothing, not because Margaret had forgotten her, but because Margaret did not know she existed. Clara was the newest member of staff, arrived after Margaret's last visit, and no one had mentioned her name. Clara did not mind. She was not a person who minded being overlooked. She had spent her entire life being overlooked, and she had made peace with it, the way you make peace with the weather. You cannot change it, you can only dress for it. Margaret found her brother in the library. This alone was enough to make her stop in the doorway and press her hand to her mouth, because the last time she had tried the library door, it had been locked, and Edward had told her, in the flattest voice she had ever heard, that the library was closed. The library was open. Edward was sitting in the green chair. He was reading a book that lay open on his knee, and he was wearing a new suit, one of the 3 that had come back from the tailor with new elbows and fresh hems, and his hair was cut, and his face was shaved, and he looked, for the first time in 6 years, like a man who was aware that other people might see him, and had decided to care about what they saw. "Edward," Margaret said, from the doorway. He looked up. "You are early." "I am on time. You have simply forgotten what on time looks like." He almost smiled. It was not a smile, not yet, but it was the muscle memory of a smile, the face remembering a shape it used to make, the way a hand remembers a gesture it has not performed in years. The corners of his mouth moved. The movement did not complete itself. But it began, and beginning was everything. Margaret entered the library and sat in the chair across from him, and they talked. Not about Catherine, not about the fire, not about the 6 years of silence and solitude, and the slow, methodical dismantling of a life. They talked about Margaret's husband, who had taken on a difficult case involving a disputed inheritance, and was working long hours and eating his dinners at his desk. They talked about the East Fields, which had finally drained after Edward had read a book about agricultural engineering and ordered new ditches cut along the lower boundary. They talked about the twin colts, who were growing fast and had developed personalities that the stablemaster described as troublesome and delightful in equal measure. They did not talk about Clara. Edward did not mention her name. Margaret did not know to ask. But the evidence of Clara was everywhere, in every open door and every lit fire and every small, accumulating sign that the house was waking up, and Margaret, who was perceptive in the way that sisters are perceptive, filed these observations away and waited. Christmas morning was cold and bright, the kind of December day that England produces once or twice a season, when the clouds part and the sun comes through, and the frost on the ground catches the light and throws it back in a million tiny fires. Clara woke before dawn and lay in her bed and watched the frost on her window turn gold as the sun rose. She dressed and went downstairs and found the kitchen already alive. Mrs. Geddes had been cooking since 3 in the morning. The goose was in the oven. The pudding was steaming. The kitchen smelled of sage and butter and roasting meat, and the particular, unmistakable scent of a house that has decided, at least for one day, to celebrate. Clara laid the fires in the east wing. She laid them with extra care, using the driest oak and the best kindling, building each fire the way her father had taught her to build a fire, which was not the efficient way or the fast way but the beautiful way. A fire that would last. A fire that would burn steady and warm through a long winter day and still have coals at midnight. She delivered the morning tea tray to the study and knocked twice and did not wait. She cleaned the bedrooms and the dressing room and the sitting room with the piano, whose lid was still open, whose keys still bore the marks of fingers that had pressed them tentatively, experimentally, the way you press your foot into cold water to test the temperature. By noon, the house was ready. The dining room table was set with china that had not been used in 6 years. The candelabras were polished and fitted with new candles. The goose was resting. The pudding was done. Mrs. Geddes had made a gravy that Arthur described, with the solemnity of a man delivering testimony, as the finest liquid in England. The staff ate their Christmas dinner in the servants' hall at 2 o'clock. Mrs. Geddes had prepared a second goose for the household, smaller but no less lovingly cooked, and there was roast beef and potatoes and carrots and bread sauce and gravy and pudding with brandy butter. And Simon had somehow acquired a bottle of port that he refused to explain the provenance of, and Polly wore the paper crown from a cracker that Mrs. Geddes had bought in the village, and looked so happy that Clara's chest hurt. Clara ate and laughed and drank a small glass of port that went straight to her head and made the candlelight softer and the voices around her warmer and the distance between the servants' hall and the dining room, where the Duke and Lady Margaret were eating their own Christmas dinner, both smaller and larger than it had ever been. After dinner, Clara washed up. She washed plates and pots and glasses and cutlery with the methodical attention of a woman who needs something to do with her hands because her mind will not be still. She washed and dried and stacked and put away, and when everything was clean, she hung her apron on the hook and went to the servants' hall, where the others were sitting around the fire. Mrs. Phelps had retired. Harding was reading in his chair. Mrs. Geddes was asleep with her feet on a stool and her chin on her chest. Arthur and Simon were playing cards. Polly was reading her new book by the firelight, her lips moving as she sounded out the longer words. Clara sat in the corner and took the tin box from her pocket. She had carried it with her today, all the notes, because it was Christmas, and she was sentimental, and she wanted them near her. She opened the box and looked at the folded papers inside, and did not take them out, because the room was full of people, and the notes were private, and some things are not meant to be shared, even with people you trust. She closed the box and put it back in her pocket, and sat and listened to the fire, and the cards, and Polly's quiet reading, and the distant, indistinct sound of conversation from somewhere above, the sound of 2 voices in a dining room, one low and one bright, talking about things she could not hear but could imagine. She wondered if Edward was smiling. She wondered if Margaret had managed to crack the seal, to find the opening, to reach the man behind the walls. She wondered if Christmas dinner with his sister, in a room full of candles and china, and a goose, that Mrs. Geddes had been cooking since 3 in the morning, was enough to bring a man back from 6 years of silence. She did not know. She could not know. She was a maid in the servants' hall, and the Duke was 3 rooms and a whole social order away, and the distance between them was measured in more than corridors. But she hoped. She sat in the corner of the servants' hall on Christmas night, with a tin box of notes in her apron pocket, and she hoped, and hoping was a thing she had not done in a very long time, because hoping requires the belief that things can change, and Clara had stopped believing in change, around the same time her mother had stopped believing in anything at all. She was learning to believe again. This terrified her. Belief is the scaffolding of disappointment, and Clara had been disappointed enough times to know that the higher you build, the harder you fall, and the fall is always worse than the not building, because the not building is safe, and the building is brave, and bravery, despite what stories say, does not always pay off. But she sat there, and she hoped, and she held her tin box, and somewhere above her, in a dining room lit by candles that had not been lit in 6 years, the Duke of Granville looked at his sister across the table, and said something that made Margaret put down her glass and stare at him, with an expression that was equal parts shock and joy. "Someone left me a note," he said, "and I found that I wanted to write back." Margaret did not ask who. She did not push. She had learned, over 6 years of quarterly visits and tearful departures, that pushing Edward was like pushing the east wall of the house. The wall does not move. You simply exhaust yourself against it. She picked up her glass. She drank. She looked at her brother in the candlelight and saw something in his face that she had been waiting 6 years to see. Not a smile, not yet, but the readiness for one, the facial equivalent of a cleared stage, a tuned instrument, a fire laid and waiting for the match. Something was coming. Margaret could feel it the way she could feel weather, the way animals feel earthquakes before the ground shakes, a vibration in the air that precedes the event and announces its arrival to those who are paying attention. Margaret was paying attention. Downstairs, Clara stood and stretched and said good night to the room, and climbed the back stairs to her attic, and sat on her bed, and opened the tin box, and read the notes from beginning to end, every one, in order, from the first note about birch and oak, to the last note, which said, "Here is becoming more bearable than it was." She read them all. Then she folded them and put them back in the box, and put the box under her pillow and lay down. "Happy Christmas, sir," she said, to the ceiling, to the house, to the man 3 floors below. The house creaked. The wind pressed against the window. The frost thickened on the glass. Clara slept, and did not dream, and woke to a new year that was already, in ways she could not yet see, beginning to take shape around her. January arrived with ice on the inside of the windows, and a letter from Lady Margaret that Mrs. Phelps received on the 3rd of the month, and read twice, and put in her desk drawer, and did not discuss with anyone except Harding, and even then, only in a whisper, standing by the kitchen range, where the heat would cover the sound of their voices. The letter was about Clara. Not directly. Margaret had not written Clara's name. She had written, "I believe there is a member of your staff who has had a particular effect on my brother's disposition. I do not need to know who this person is. I need only to know that they are being treated well and that their position is secure. Edward is changing. The change is fragile. I will not see it disrupted by a staffing decision." Mrs. Phelps read this letter and understood it completely, and said nothing about it to anyone, because Mrs. Phelps was a woman who understood that the most powerful thing you can do with information is choose not to use it. Clara, meanwhile, was unaware that she had a protector. She was unaware of most things that happened beyond the borders of her own duties, because her world was small and specific, and defined by the rhythm of fires and tea trays and notes on a desk. She knew the East Wing. She knew the servants' hall. She knew the path between them. Everything else was foreign territory. But the world was pushing in. It started with the garden. Edward had mentioned the garden several times in his notes, always in the past tense, always in the language of a man describing a country he once visited and will never return to. Catherine planted the roses. Catherine designed the parterre. Catherine spent whole afternoons on her knees in the soil, with her sleeves rolled up and her hair falling down, and the gardener, old Harold, standing behind her, with a look of horrified admiration, because the Duchess was not supposed to dig, but the Duchess did not care what she was supposed to do. In the 3rd week of January, Edward wrote a note that was different from the others. It was not a question. It was not an observation. It was a request. "I would like to walk in the garden. I have not done so since Catherine died. I find that I cannot do it alone. Would you walk with me?" Clara read this note, and her hands shook, not from cold, though the study was cold despite the fire, because January in Derbyshire is cold the way the ocean is wet, fundamentally and without compromise. Her hands shook because the note was asking her to step out of the margins and into the text, to stop being a voice on paper and become a person in the room, to stand beside the Duke of Granville in broad daylight, in the garden his dead wife had planted, and walk. She wrote back, yes. 1 word, 3 letters. The mirror of his answer about the piano lid. She left it on the desk and went downstairs and sat in the scullery and peeled potatoes for Mrs. Geddes and did not trust herself to speak for an hour. The walk happened on a Thursday. Clara put on her heaviest shawl and her outdoor boots, which were not truly outdoor boots, but indoor boots, that had given up pretending to be waterproof. She went to the east wing at the time Edward had specified in his note, 2:30, when the winter light was at its strongest, which in January means approximately the brightness of a candle seen through a curtain. He was waiting at the garden door, standing with his hands behind his back, and his coat buttoned to the collar, and his face set in the expression of a man who has decided to do something, and is now committed to it, and is terrified, and will not show it, because showing it would make it real, and making it real would give him the option of stopping, and he does not want the option of stopping, because stopping is what he has been doing for 6 years, and stopping is easy, and this is not going to be easy. Clara stopped 3 feet from him. They looked at each other. This was the first time they had been face to face since the staircase. 2 months of notes and books and the accumulated intimacy of two people who have shared their inner lives on paper without ever sharing a room. He was taller than she remembered, thinner. The new suit fit him well, but it hung on his frame the way clothes hang on a man who has lost weight he could not afford to lose. His eyes were the same gray, but the quality of the gray had changed. It was not the gray of a window in a room with no curtains. It was the gray of a window in a room where someone has pulled the curtains halfway back, letting in a strip of light that falls across the floor, in a line so sharp it looks like a cut. "Miss Byrne," he said. "Your Grace." They stood there. The formality of the address sat between them like a piece of furniture in the wrong place, something they both had to step around. "Shall we?" he said, and opened the garden door, and they went out. The garden was winter bare. The roses on the south wall were leafless, their canes dark and thorned against the stone. The flower beds were empty. The paths were covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched under their feet. The kitchen garden was stripped down to its bones, just bare soil and the skeletal remains of last summer's herbs, with the exception of the rosemary, which was green and pungent and alive, because rosemary does not care about seasons. They walked in silence for the first 5 minutes, not the silence of the house, which was heavy and closed and enforced. This was a different kind of silence, an outdoor silence, a silence made of cold air and bird calls and the crunch of frost underfoot, a silence with space in it, a silence that was choosing not to be filled, rather than demanding not to be broken. Edward walked with his hands clasped behind his back. Clara walked beside him, half a step behind, because habit and training and 200 years of social hierarchy told her that half a step behind was where she belonged. But the path was narrow and the frost was slippery, and after she nearly lost her footing on a patch of ice, Edward stopped and held out his arm. "The path is treacherous," he said. Clara looked at his arm. She looked at his face. She looked at his arm again. She took it. His arm was solid under the wool of his coat. She could feel the bone and muscle and the warmth of his body through the fabric, and the warmth was surprising, because everything about this man suggested cold, suggested stone, suggested the absence of heat, but he was warm. He was a warm person wearing a cold exterior, and the distinction between the two was something Clara felt in her fingertips and would not forget. They walked through the parterre, which was a formal arrangement of low hedges and gravel paths that Catherine had designed from a book of French garden plans, through the rose garden, where the canes scratched at the air like the fingers of someone trying to get your attention, past the small pond, which was frozen solid, a disk of white ice with bubbles trapped beneath the surface like tiny rooms. Edward stopped at the pond. "She fell in here once," he said. Clara waited. It was July. She was reaching for something at the edge, a flower, I think. She leaned too far and went in up to her waist. The water was barely 3 feet deep, but she came up looking as though she had been baptized by a very enthusiastic vicar. He was not looking at Clara. He was looking at the frozen pond. His voice was even, controlled, the voice of a man telling a story he has rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. I laughed. She was furious. She threw a lily pad at me. It hit me in the chest and slid down my shirt, and I spent the rest of the afternoon smelling like pond water, and she refused to apologize, because she said the lily pad was justified, and I said nothing is justified that involves pond water down a man's shirt, and she said. He stopped. Clara felt his arm tighten under her hand, a small, involuntary contraction, the body remembering before the mind can catch up, the muscles seizing around a memory that is still sharp enough to cut. He did not finish the story. He did not say what Catherine had said. He let the sentence hang in the cold air, unfinished, the way so many things in this house were unfinished. The sock, the books, the garden, the life. Clara said nothing. She held his arm. She stood beside him at the frozen pond and let the silence hold the weight of what he could not say, because silence can hold things that words cannot, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person who is drowning in memory is to stand on the shore and wait. They stood there for a long time, long enough for the cold to work its way through Clara's shawl and into her bones, long enough for the light to change, the January sun dropping lower in the sky, turning the frost on the ground from white to gold. Then Edward moved. He turned from the pond, and they continued walking, and he did not speak again for the rest of the walk, but he did not let go of her arm, and she did not let go of his. They returned to the house through the garden door. Edward released her arm in the doorway, and the absence of his warmth was a physical thing, a cold space on her hand where his arm had been. "Thank you, Miss Byrne," he said. "You are welcome, Your Grace." He turned to go. Then he stopped. He did not turn back, but he spoke, and his voice was different now, lower, rougher, as though the words were being dragged up from somewhere deep. "She would have liked you." 3 words that landed on Clara like a wave. She stood in the doorway and felt them hit her and wash through her and recede, leaving her changed, the way water changes the shape of a shore, not in one rush but in the accumulated weight of 10,000 small contacts. She would have liked you. He had thought about this. He had imagined his dead wife and Clara in the same room, in the same world, and he had decided that they would have been compatible, and he had told her so, and this was not a compliment or an observation, it was a gift. The gift of being included in the story of a woman she had never met, but had come to know through dog-eared novels and penciled annotations, and a green chair by a window, and a half-finished blue sock in a desk drawer. Clara went downstairs. She sat in the scullery, and did not peel potatoes, and did not wash dishes, and did not do anything, except sit, and breathe, and hold the words in her mind, and feel them settling into her bones, the way the cold had settled into her bones on the walk. Deeply, permanently, in a way that would not be warmed away by a fire. She would have liked you. Clara put her face in her hands. She did not cry. Clara Byrne did not cry in kitchens. Clara Byrne cried in her room, at night, in the dark, where no one could see, and no one could hear, and the tears could fall on the pillow, and be absorbed, and disappear, and in the morning, the pillow would be dry, and no one would know. But she came close. She came so close that her breath hitched, and her eyes burned, and her chest did the thing it did when grief and joy arrive at the same moment, and collide in the space between her ribs, and she cannot tell which is which, because they feel the same. They feel exactly the same. They are the same. She took her hands from her face. She stood. She straightened her apron. She went to the kitchen and asked Mrs. Geddes if there was anything that needed doing, and Mrs. Geddes looked at her face, and saw something, and said, "Sit down, and have a cup of tea, girl." Clara sat down. She had a cup of tea. The tea was hot and strong, and tasted of nothing except tea, which was exactly what she needed, because she had had enough of things that tasted of more than themselves for one afternoon. The walks became regular. Every Thursday, at 2:30, Clara met Edward at the garden door, and they walked. Through January and into February, through frost and rain, and the occasional burst of winter sun that made the frozen ground sparkle as though it had been scattered with broken glass. They talked. Not constantly, not easily, not the way people talk who have known each other for years and have used up all the careful topics and can now say whatever comes to mind. They talk the way people talk who are learning a new language, testing words, listening for the echo, checking to see if what they said was what they meant, and what the other person heard was what they intended. Edward told her about the estate, about the tenant farmers who depended on him, and the drainage problems in the East Fields, and the stable master's opinion of the twin colts, which was that they were the finest horses he had bred in 30 years, and also the most annoying. He told her about Parliament, which he had been avoiding for 3 years, and which his solicitor was beginning to insist he return to. He told her about Margaret, who had written him 7 letters since Christmas, each one longer and more hopeful than the last. Clara told him about Shropshire, about her sisters, who had married and moved away, and who wrote to her on birthdays and at Christmas, with letters that were mostly about their children and their husbands and the price of wool, which was apparently a topic of great interest in the parts of England where Clara's sisters had settled. She told him about the wasp and the curtain and the fire that had cost her a job and a reference and a small piece of her dignity that she was still trying to locate. Edward made a sound when she told this story, a sound that came from his chest, not his throat, a sound that was brief and quiet and could have been many things. It was, Clara realized with a shock that traveled through her whole body like an electric charge, a laugh. The Duke of Granville laughed. It was small. It was suppressed almost as soon as it emerged, pushed back down like a plant that has poked through the soil and been hastily recovered. But it happened. Clara heard it. She felt it vibrate through his arm, which she was holding because the path was slippery, or because she wanted to hold his arm, or because the distinction between necessity and desire had gotten blurred somewhere around the second week of walks, and she had stopped trying to untangle them. He laughed. And then he looked at her, and his face did something she had never seen it do. The muscles around his eyes moved. The corners of his mouth lifted. The expression lasted less than a second. A flash, a flicker, a match struck in a dark room that illuminates everything for one instant before the darkness returns. But Clara saw it. She saw the face of a man who had remembered, for one fraction of a second, what it felt like to be amused. What it felt like to have a reaction to the world that was not grief, not loss, not the dull, heavy endurance of a man carrying a weight he cannot put down. She saw it, and she held it, and she did not comment on it, because commenting on it would have made it self-conscious, and self-consciousness would have killed it. Instead, she continued her story about the wasp, adding details she had not planned to add, making the wasp bigger, making the curtain more flammable, making her own panic more absurd, because she wanted to hear the sound again. She did not hear it again, not that day. But the ground had shifted. Something had cracked open that could not be closed, and they both felt it, and neither of them spoke about it, and the not speaking was not silence. It was discretion. It was two people agreeing, without words, to let a fragile thing grow in its own time. They walked back to the house as the light failed. Edward released her arm at the garden door. Clara went downstairs. She sat in her room and took the tin box from under her pillow, and held it, and did not open it, and stared at the frosted window, and thought about the sound he had made. A laugh. Small, suppressed, real. The first music in this house in some time, she thought. And she smiled, alone in her cold room, at the top of the back stairs, in a house that was learning, one Thursday at a time, how to make sound again. February turned into March, and the ground thawed, and the crocuses came up in the garden like small, defiant fists punching through the soil, purple and yellow and white. And Clara stood at the edge of the flower bed during her afternoon walk with Edward, and looked at them and said, "Catherine planted these, did she not?" Edward looked at the crocuses. "She planted everything. They are still here." "Yes, that is something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She planted them the year we were married. She said crocuses were the bravest flowers because they come up before winter is finished. They do not wait for permission." Clara looked at the crocuses and thought about bravery and permission, and the fact that she had been walking arm in arm with the Duke of Granville every Thursday for 6 weeks, and neither of them had asked anyone's permission, and neither of them intended to. The household had noticed the walks. Of course it had. A household of 12 people living in the same building notices everything, the way a body notices a splinter. The information travels. Mrs. Phelps knew. Harding knew. Mrs. Geddes knew. Arthur and Simon knew. Polly, who was 15 and romantic, and had been reading her fairy tale book every night since Christmas, knew and had constructed an elaborate fantasy about the Duke and the maid that bore no relationship to reality but made her happy, which was the main thing. Nobody said anything. This was remarkable. In any other household, the gossip would have been immediate, fierce, and destructive. A maid walking with the master. A maid receiving notes from the master. A maid who lingered in the east wing longer than her duties required, and who hummed in the corridors with the carefree energy of a person who has somewhere to belong. But Ashworth Manor was not any other household. The staff had lived through 6 years of grief. They had watched their employer withdraw from the world, watched the house close down room by room, watched the silence descend like a fog that would not lift. They had stayed. They had stayed through the silence and the cold and the endurance, and they had done so not because they were paid well, which they were, but because loyalty in a household like this is a living thing, an organism that feeds on proximity and shared experience and the accumulated weight of years. They were loyal to Edward. They were loyal to the house, and now they were loyal to whatever was happening between the Duke and the maid, because whatever it was bringing the house back to life, and they would protect it the way they protected the silver and the china and the portraits on the walls, silently, fiercely, without discussion. Mrs. Phelps called Clara to her sitting room on a Tuesday evening in March. Clara went with the cold dread of a woman who has been caught and is about to be punished, because Clara's experience with authority figures calling her to private meetings was uniformly negative and usually ended with the words, "Your services are no longer required." Mrs. Phelps was sitting at her desk. The lamp was lit. The room smelled of lavender and furniture polish, and the particular, astringent scent of a woman who has maintained order in a large house for 20 years, through sheer force of will. "Sit down, Miss Byrne." Clara sat. Her hands were in her lap. Her heart was in her throat. Mrs. Phelps looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Clara did not expect. "Lady Margaret has written to me." Clara blinked. "She has written to say that whatever is happening in this house, she approves of it. She has written to say that the Duke is more present, more engaged, more alive than he has been in 6 years. She has written to say that she does not need to know the cause, only that the cause is protected." Mrs. Phelps paused. Her eyes were steady. Her face was unreadable. "I believe you are the cause, Miss Byrne." Clara opened her mouth. No sound came out. She closed it again. "I am not asking you to confirm or deny this. I am telling you that your position in this house is secure. I am telling you that you will not be questioned about your duties in the East Wing or the amount of time you spend there. I am telling you that the staff have been instructed to afford you the same discretion they afford the Duke." Another pause. "I am also telling you to be careful." Clara found her voice. "Careful, ma'am? The Duke is a good man. He was a good man before Catherine died, and he has been a broken man since. And broken men are dangerous not because they intend harm, but because they do not know their own capacity for it. He does not know what he needs. He knows only what he lacks. These are not the same thing." Clara sat with this. She turned it over in her mind, the way you turn over a stone, looking at all the sides, examining the weight and texture of it. "I understand, ma'am. I doubt that you do, but I have said what I came to say, and I will not say it again." Mrs. Phelps stood. Clara stood. The meeting was over. Clara walked to the door. "Miss Byrne." Clara turned. Mrs. Phelps was looking at her with an expression that Clara had never seen on the housekeeper's face. It was not warmth, exactly. Mrs. Phelps did not do warmth the way other people did warmth. It was more like the acknowledgement of a colleague, one soldier to another, a recognition that they were both fighting the same campaign. "The porcelain shepherdess," Mrs. Phelps said. "The one you broke on your first day." Clara winced. "I glued it back together that evening. It sits on the shelf in my sitting room. The seams are visible if you know where to look." She paused. "Most things that are broken can be repaired, Miss Byrne. The seams show, but the thing stands." Clara left the room and walked down the corridor and stood at the bottom of the back stairs and breathed. She breathed in and out and felt the air move through her lungs and thought about shepherdesses and seams and things that stand despite being broken. Then she went upstairs and wrote a note. She did not leave it on the desk. She held it. She read it and reread it and considered destroying it, and then, with the reckless courage of a crocus pushing through frozen soil, she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went to the study the next morning and laid it on the desk beside the glass paperweight and left before her nerve failed. The note said, "I walked in the garden today without you. The crocuses are up. They are brave. I would like to be brave. I would like to tell you that these notes and these walks are the best part of my life, and that I carry your words in my pocket like coins from a country I have never visited, but hope to see one day. I am aware that this is not something a maid should say to a duke. I am also aware that you are not a duke when you write to me. You are a man who lost everything and is finding his way back, and I am honored to be standing at the edge of the path, watching you walk." She left it on the desk. She went downstairs. She sat in the scullery and peeled turnips with the fierce concentration of a woman who is not thinking about turnips. The reply came the next morning. Edward's handwriting was different. Not larger, not smaller, but shaking. The pen had trembled. The ink was uneven, thicker in places where the nib had pressed too hard, thinner in places where the hand had pulled back, as though the hand and the mind were arguing about how much pressure to apply. "Clara, not Miss Byrne, Clara. You are not standing at the edge of the path. You are the path. I did not know this when you arrived. I did not know it when you knocked into me on the staircase, or when you wrote me an impertinent note about my hearing. I know it now. I have known it for weeks, and I have not said it, because saying it makes it real, and real things can be lost, and I have lost enough. But you asked me to be brave, so I will try. You are not a maid when you write to me either. You are the first person in 6 years who has spoken to me as though I am still here. Everyone else speaks to the grief. You speak to the man. I did not know there was a difference until you showed me. I do not know what to do with this. I do not know what is possible or permissible or wise. I know only that Thursday is the best day of my week, and the reason is not the garden." Clara read this note 7 times. She held it with both hands, because one hand was not steady enough. She read it standing in the study, which was empty, and the fire was burning, oak, the smell of it filling the room, and the light was coming through the windows, March light, stronger than January light, brighter, more insistent, light that was finished with winter and ready for something else. She put the note in her pocket. She did not cry. She went to work. She laid fires and dusted shelves and delivered tea and hummed off-key in the corridors and did everything she was supposed to do and felt, all day, like she was carrying a live thing in her pocket, a small bird, a heartbeat wrapped in paper. Thursday came. They walked. They did not speak about the notes. They walked through the garden and looked at the crocuses and the first green shoots of the daffodils and the swelling buds on the rose canes and the rosemary, which was blooming now, tiny pale blue flowers that smelled clean and sharp and alive. Clara held Edward's arm. Edward held Clara's arm. The distinction between who was supporting whom had disappeared weeks ago. They were holding each other. 2 people walking through a garden that a dead woman had planted, surrounded by things that were coming back to life, because that is what things do in spring. They come back, they push through, they do not wait for permission. At the pond, Edward stopped. The ice was gone. The water was dark and still, and reflected the gray sky above and the bare branches of the willow tree that hung over the far edge. "I have something to tell you," he said. Clara waited. She felt his arm tighten, the same involuntary contraction she had felt in January, the muscles clenching around a memory. "I have been going to the library every evening. I sit in her chair, I read her books, I find her annotations and I read those too, and sometimes I talk to her, not out loud, in my head. I tell her about the garden and the crocuses and the estate and Margaret. I tell her about you." Clara's breath caught. "I tell her about the maid who hums off-key and writes impertinent notes, and broke a porcelain shepherdess on her first day, and ran into me on the staircase, and smells of lemon oil, and reads books in the wrong order, and is, somehow, despite all evidence of coordination and judgment, the most remarkable person I have met since her." He was still not looking at Clara. He was looking at the pond. "And I find that telling her does not hurt the way I expected it to. I find that she would understand. I find that she would say something like, 'It is about time, Edward,' because Catherine was never patient with self-pity, not even mine, and 6 years of silence would have infuriated her." He paused. The pond reflected nothing. "I thought that letting someone new into my life would mean letting her go. I was wrong. She is here. She is in the garden she planted, and the books she annotated, and the chair she sat in, and the piano she played. She is not going anywhere, and I am tired of going nowhere with her." Clara stood beside him at the pond and felt tears on her face, and did not wipe them away, because wiping them away would have meant letting go of his arm, and she was not going to let go of his arm. "I am going to start living again," Edward said. "I do not know how. I do not know what it looks like. I know only that it begins here, in this garden, on a Thursday, in March, with you." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say. Words were too small. Language was too small. The English language, with its 250,000 words, did not have a word for what she felt, which was something between grief and joy and terror and hope, all of them happening at once, all of them occupying the same space in her chest, pressing against each other like passengers in a crowded carriage. She held his arm. He held hers. They stood at the pond and let the silence hold them. And the silence was not the silence of Ashworth Manor, not the heavy, enforced silence of a house in mourning. It was the silence of two people who have said the truest things they know how to say and are resting, for a moment, in the aftermath. The daffodils would be up by next week. The roses would bud by April. The garden was coming back, not because anyone had asked it to, not because anyone had given it permission, but because that is what gardens do. They grow. They return. They push through the frozen ground and reach for the light and refuse, absolutely refuse, to stay buried. Clara and Edward walked back to the house. At the garden door, he did not release her arm immediately. He held it for a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment, something passed between them that was not a word, and not a touch, and not a promise, but was all three, compressed into the space of a second. Then he let go, and she went downstairs, and the house continued its slow, patient work of becoming a home again. The drawer changed everything. It was the last week of March, a morning so ordinary that Clara would later marvel at how the most significant moments of a life can arrive without announcement, without ceremony, without so much as a change in the weather to signal that the ground is about to shift beneath your feet. She was cleaning the study. Edward was not there. She knew his schedule now, the way she knew her own heartbeat. Predictable, reliable, capable of variation, but rarely varying. At this hour, 6:30, he was in his bedroom, shaving, while Harding laid out his clothes and said nothing, because Harding and Edward had perfected a form of companionship that required no words, only proximity, and the shared understanding that some men do not need to talk to not be alone. Clara was dusting the desk. She had dusted this desk every morning for 5 months. She knew its surface the way a pianist knows a keyboard, by touch, by memory, by the geography of objects that had been in the same position for years. The glass paperweight, the brass compass, the river stone, the ink pot, the pen tray, the stack of papers weighted by whatever book Edward was currently reading. Her cloth caught the edge of a drawer. The drawer slid open, 2 inches, 3, enough to reveal what was inside. She looked down. The small oil painting was face down, as it always was. She had glimpsed it before, months ago, on a day when the drawer had been slightly ajar, and she had closed the drawer without touching anything inside. She had learned, in her months at Ashworth Manor, that some doors are meant to be walked past, not walked through. But today the cloth had pulled the drawer further than before, and the painting had shifted with the motion, and the edge of something else was visible beneath it. A sock, small, blue wool, half-finished, with the knitting needles still attached. The yarn was still connected to a ball that sat in the corner of the drawer, pale blue, undisturbed, as though the person who had been knitting had put it down for a moment and would be back any minute to finish. Clara did not touch it. She did not need to. She knew what it was. She knew it the way you know certain truths, before anyone explains them, the way a child knows what an empty chair at the dinner table means, before anyone says the word. The sock was for the baby, for the child who was going to be named James, for the child who had died with Catherine in the fire, in the nursery, behind a door that had warped shut in the heat, a door that could not be opened from the outside, a door that Edward had been 3 hours too far away to reach. Catherine had been knitting this sock. She had been making it for her son, her first child, the baby who had not yet arrived, or had only just arrived. Clara did not know the details, and did not need to know them. She knew only that the sock was half finished, and would never be finished, and that it sat in this drawer, beneath a face-down painting, and that Edward opened this drawer and looked at these things, or did not open this drawer and knew they were there. And either way, the sock, and the painting, and the ball of blue yarn were the physical manifestation of a grief so specific and so enormous that it could not be contained in memory alone. It needed objects, it needed weight, it needed a drawer that could be opened and closed, a small, private mausoleum within the larger mausoleum of the house. Clara closed the drawer. Carefully, silently. She aligned the edge the way it had been, matching the position to her memory of how the drawer looked when it was properly closed. She turned around. Edward was in the doorway. He was dressed for the day. Shaved. Suited. His hair combed. His face composed. A man prepared for a morning at his desk. Papers to review. Letters to answer. The daily machinery of an estate that ran whether he wanted it to or not. His eyes went to her hand, to the drawer, to the space between the drawer and her hand, the space that told him everything he needed to know about what she had seen. The change was instant. It was not gradual, not a slow withdrawal, not the gentle closing of a door. It was a slamming. Every crack she had opened over the past 5 months, every small fissure in the wall he had built around himself, sealed shut in the space between one breath and the next. His face went flat. His eyes went cold. The gray of a window in a room where the curtains have been pulled shut and nailed in place. His jaw set. His shoulders squared. He was not Edward. He was the Duke. The title was a suit of armor, and he put it on in a second, and the man who had told her about the crocuses, and the lily pad, and the fact that she was the path, that man was gone, locked behind the title, behind the grief, behind the door of the nursery that could not be opened. Get out. 2 words. The same 2 words he had spoken to her on the staircase, the first time, the morning she had collided with him. But these were different. These were not the words of a man startled by contact. These were the words of a man who has been seen in a place he did not want to be seen, who has been caught with his armor off, who has been found standing over the grave of the thing that destroyed him, and who cannot bear the witness. Sir, I did not mean to. Get out. Clara left. She did not trip. She did not stumble. She walked out of the study with her back straight, and her hands at her sides, and her face as controlled as she could make it, which was not very controlled at all, because Clara's face had never learned the trick of hiding what she felt, and what she felt right now was a pain so sharp and so specific that it had a physical location, a point just below her left collarbone, where the hurt had landed and was spreading. She made it to the servants' staircase. She sat on the 3rd step, the same step she had sat on 5 months ago on her first day, after the porcelain shepherdess, after Mrs. Phelps's instructions, after the first overwhelming encounter with the silence of Ashworth Manor. She put her forehead on her knees. She breathed. She counted breaths the way her father had taught her to count when she was overwhelmed. 1 breath for every finger. 10 breaths. Start again. She sat there until the cold made her move. The days that followed were the hardest Clara had lived through since her mother died. Edward stopped writing notes. The desk was bare. No questions. No observations. No book recommendations. No small folded papers left for her to find and carry in her pocket, like talismans against loneliness. The walk stopped. Thursday came and went, and the garden door stayed closed. The study door stayed closed too. Not locked, but closed in a way that communicated more than a lock could. Clara laid the fire at 5 in the morning, before Edward woke. She placed the tea tray at 9 and 1 and 5, and knocked twice, and did not wait. She dusted and polished and cleaned with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who has removed feeling from the equation and is running on procedure alone. She was professional. She was correct. She was everything a good maid should be, and nothing that Clara Byrne actually was, because Clara Byrne was noise and warmth and off-key humming and impertinent notes, and a heart that she wore so close to the surface that you could practically see it beating through her clothes. She stopped humming. This was the thing that scared her the most. Not the silence from Edward, not the closed door, not the absence of notes, but her own silence. The songs that had lived in her throat since childhood, the melodies her father had taught her, the Barbara Allen that she had hummed every morning in the corridors, those songs went quiet. Not because she chose to silence them, but because the silence was contagious. It spread from Edward to the house, and from the house to Clara, and before she knew it, she was as quiet as the rest of them, another body moving through the manor without making a sound. Mrs. Geddes noticed first. She cornered Clara in the kitchen on the 5th day. "You are not eating." "I am eating, Mrs. Geddes." "You are moving food around a plate. I have seen enough girls do it to know the difference. Eat." Mrs. Geddes placed a bowl of soup in front of Clara, with the firm authority of a woman who believed that most of the world's problems could be solved with proper nutrition. Clara ate the soup. It was good. It was hot and thick and tasted of onions and potatoes, and the particular, indefinable quality of food that has been made by someone who cares about the person eating it. Clara ate it, and felt the warmth move through her body and settle in her stomach, and she thought about Mrs. Phelps, and the porcelain shepherdess, and the seams that show, and the thing that stands. Things that break can be repaired. But could they? Could this be repaired? The thing between her and Edward had been built on a foundation of paper and pencil, and the careful, incremental exchange of words between two people who were not supposed to be exchanging anything. It had been fragile from the beginning, held together not by the strength of its materials, but by the willingness of both parties to keep building, to keep writing, to keep reaching across the distance, and finding each other on the other side. One person had stopped reaching. The distance was back. The wall was back. The silence was back. Clara finished the soup and washed the bowl and went back to work. On the 9th day, she sat in her room after supper and opened the tin box and looked at the notes. All of them. Arranged by date, oldest at the bottom, newest on top. She read them from beginning to end, and this time, instead of feeling the warmth she usually felt when reading them, she felt something colder, something sharper, something that she recognized after a moment as anger. Not anger at Edward, anger at the drawer, anger at the sock, anger at the fire that had taken Catherine and the baby, and the life that Edward was supposed to live. Anger at grief itself, which was not an emotion but a prison, and which held Edward captive, not because he could not leave, but because leaving meant walking past the cell that contained the sock, and the painting, and the ball of blue yarn, and walking past it meant acknowledging that the contents of the cell were not the whole world, and acknowledging that the contents were not the whole world meant admitting that there was a world outside, and the world outside contained Clara, and Clara was asking him to live in it. The anger was warm. It was familiar. It was, Clara recognized with a clarity that surprised her, the same anger she had felt at her mother. The anger of a daughter watching a parent choose absence. The anger of a person who has been left behind, and who wants to scream at the person who left. I am here. I am standing right here, and you are looking at a chair, a sock, a ball of yarn, a painting, a memory, and you are choosing the memory over me, and I cannot compete with a memory, because a memory does not disappoint, and does not grow old, and does not knock things over and hum off key. She sat with the anger. She let it fill her. She let it heat the cold places that the past 9 days had created. And then, when the anger had done its work and the cold places were warm again, she did something that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. She wrote a note. Not a long note, not a careful note. Not the kind of note she usually wrote, composed over hours, edited and re-edited, every word chosen for its precision and its safety. A short note. A blunt note. A note written in one draft with no corrections and no revisions and no second thoughts, because second thoughts were what she had been having for 9 days, and second thoughts had gotten her nowhere. The note said, I saw the sock. I saw the painting. I am sorry. I did not touch them. I would never touch them. They are yours and they are sacred, and I know this. But I will not apologize for being in the room. I was doing my job, and I will not apologize for caring about you, because caring about you is not my job, but it is what I do, and I cannot stop doing it, any more than I can stop humming, which I have stopped, and the silence is terrible. You told me that I was the first music in this house. If that is true, then you have silenced me, and the house is worse for it, and you are worse for it, and I am worse for it, and none of this needed to happen. The drawer is a drawer. The sock is a sock. The painting is a painting. They are objects that hold your grief, but they are not your grief. Your grief is yours. It lives in you, not in a drawer. You can close the drawer and the grief is still there. You can open the drawer and the grief is still there. The drawer changes nothing. I am not asking you to close the drawer, or open the drawer, or throw the drawer away. I am asking you to let me back in the room. She folded the note. She put it in her apron pocket. She went to bed. She did not sleep. At 5 in the morning, she went to the study. She laid the fire. She placed the note on the desk, beside the glass paperweight. She left. She went through the day. She cleaned and polished and delivered tea, and did not hum, and did not write, and did not hope, because hope was too expensive, and she had already spent more of it than she could afford. That evening, she went to collect the last tea tray. The study door was open. On the desk, beside the glass paperweight, there was a note. The handwriting was not Edward's usual hand. It was larger, less controlled. The letters were shaky, uneven, pressed into the paper with a force that suggested the hand that wrote them was trembling. Her name was Catherine. The child was going to be called James. I was not there. I was in London. I was 3 hours away. The door warped in the heat, and it would not open, and by the time they broke through, it was too late, and I was still 3 hours away, and I will be 3 hours away for the rest of my life, and no amount of walking in gardens or writing notes or sitting in green chairs will change the distance. The distance is permanent. The distance is who I am. Below this, in smaller writing, as though the hand had exhausted itself and could barely press the pen to the paper. But you are right about the silence. The silence is terrible, and I am sorry for it. Below that, smaller still, please do not stop humming. Clara read the note 3 times. She folded it. She added it to the tin box, which had become a small library of grief and hope, and the slow, painful, imperfect process of 2 people learning to trust each other with the worst parts of themselves. She stood in the empty study and looked at the fire, which was burning low, oak coals glowing in the grate, and she opened her mouth. She hummed. Barbara Allen. Off-key. Terrible. The melody mangled beyond recognition, the notes wandering in directions the composer had never intended, the rhythm lurching and stalling and recovering and lurching again. She hummed it through once, then again, then a third time, because the sound of her own voice in the silent study was so strange and so necessary that she could not stop. When she finished, the house was quiet, but it was a different quiet, a quiet that had room in it, a quiet that was not enforced but chosen, and the choice made all the difference. Clara picked up the tea tray and went downstairs. Tomorrow was Thursday. Thursday came and Clara stood at the garden door at 2:30 and waited. She wore her heavy shawl and her outdoor boots, and she stood with her hands folded in front of her, and she waited with the patience of a woman who has decided that she will wait for as long as it takes, whether that is 5 minutes or 5 hours, or forever, because the alternative to waiting is walking away. And Clara Byrne had never walked away from anything in her life. She had been fired. She had been dismissed. She had been told that her services were no longer required, but she had never walked away. There is a difference, and the difference matters. 10 minutes passed. The clock in the corridor ticked. The garden waited, patient in the way that gardens are patient, with the slow confidence of things that have survived winters before and will survive winters again. 15 minutes. 20. Clara's hands were cold. Her nose was red. Her eyes were fixed on the corridor that led to the east wing staircase, the corridor that Edward would walk down if he was coming, the corridor that remained empty. 25 minutes. She heard footsteps. Not the measured, deliberate footsteps she had learned to identify and avoid during her first weeks in the house. These were different. Slower. Heavier. The footsteps of a man walking towards something he is afraid of, each step a negotiation between the part of him that wants to go forward and the part of him that wants to turn around. Edward appeared at the end of the corridor. He was wearing his coat. His hands were at his sides. His face was the face of a man who has not slept. The skin under his eyes bruised with exhaustion, the lines around his mouth deeper than they had been a week ago, as though the silence had aged him in ways that 6 years of grief had not managed to. He walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away, the same distance Clara had stopped at the first time they walked together, the distance of formality, of caution, of 2 people who are not sure what they are to each other, and are afraid to guess. "I am late," he said. 25 minutes, Clara said. "I was deciding." "Deciding what?" He looked at her. The gray eyes were not empty. They were not cold. They were full. Full in a way that frightened her. Full of things that had been building behind the walls for 9 days, and were now pressing against the surface, looking for a way out. "Whether I deserved this," he said. Clara felt the words land. They landed the way stones land in deep water, breaking the surface and then sinking, disappearing into the dark. You do not get to decide that, she said. He blinked. I beg your pardon? You do not get to decide whether you deserve this. You do not get to sit in your study for 9 days, deciding whether you have earned the right to walk in a garden with a maid who cares about you. That is not how it works. You do not earn kindness. You do not qualify for companionship. You do not fill out a form and submit it to a committee and wait for approval. You walk out the door. That is all you do. You walk out the door and you stand in the garden, and you let the sun touch your face, and you do not ask anyone's permission, because the sun does not require your credentials. The sun shines on everyone, even dukes who have spent 6 years deciding they do not deserve it. She was breathing hard. She had not planned to say any of this. The words had come from a place she did not know she had, a deep, angry, tender place that had been filling up for months and had finally overflowed. Edward stared at her. His mouth was slightly open. His arms were at his sides. He looked, in that moment, like a man who has been hit by something unexpected. Not a fist, not a blow, but a truth. And the truth has knocked him off balance in a way that no amount of bracing could have prevented. Clara opened the garden door. Are you coming? She said. He came. They walked. Through the garden, past the crocuses, which were fading now, their petals softening and curling as the daffodils took over, yellow and bright and swaying in the March wind. Past the rose garden, where the buds were swelling, tight green fists that would open in a month, 2 months, whenever the warmth arrived and persuaded them. Past the pond, which was dark and still, and reflecting the clouds above. They walked in silence for a while, and the silence was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not the silence of avoidance. It was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of 2 people who have said the hard things and are now resting, the way runners rest after a long race. Not because they are finished, but because they need to catch their breath before they continue. Edward spoke first. I owe you an explanation. You owe me nothing. I owe you the truth, which is more than nothing. The truth is that when I saw you at the drawer, I felt exposed, not angry. Exposed. The drawer is the last private place I have. Everything else in this house has been opened, cleaned, aired, made public by the act of living. The library is open. The dining room is open. The drawing room is open. But the drawer remained mine. The sock and the painting and the ball of yarn remained mine. And when I saw you standing beside it, I felt as though the last wall had been breached, and without that wall, there was nothing between me and the full weight of what I have lost. He paused. They kept walking. But you were right. In your note, the grief is not in the drawer. The grief is in me. The drawer is an excuse. The drawer is a place where I keep the grief so that I can close it and pretend the grief is closed too. And it is not. It is never closed. It is open all the time. And the drawer is a lie I tell myself to make the open wound feel like a scar. Clara held his arm. She felt the tension in it, the muscles tight beneath the wool, the body bracing against the words it was producing. The way a building braces against a wind it knows it cannot stop. I have been lying to myself for 6 years, Edward said. The silence was a lie. The closed doors were a lie. The not eating and the not speaking and the not living were all lies, and I told them because the truth was too heavy, and I thought if I put it down, I would have nothing to carry, and if I had nothing to carry, I would float away, and there would be nothing left of me. He stopped walking. They were at the far end of the garden, near the boundary wall, where the estate met the wild land beyond. The wall was old, stone, patched and repatched over centuries, held together by moss and gravity, and the stubbornness of things that have stood for so long they have forgotten how to fall. But I did not float away, he said. I am still here. 6 years, and I am still here, and the grief is still here, and the truth is that I can carry both, the grief and the living. They do not cancel each other out. They do not require a choice. I was told, after Catherine died, by well-meaning people, that I would move on. I despised the phrase, move on, as though grief is a town you pass through on the way to somewhere better. It is not a town. It is a country. It is where I live. But a country can have more than one city. A country can have grief, and also have gardens and crocuses, and notes left on desks, and Thursday walks, and a maid who hums off-key, and tells me that the sun does not require my credentials. Clara's eyes were wet. she did not wipe them. She had learned, over the past months, that wiping tears away is a form of denial, and she was done with denial. "I am going to live in this country," Edward said. "Both cities, the grief and the living. I do not know how to do it. I suspect I will do it badly. I suspect I will retreat, and close doors, and stop talking, and make you angry again, because old habits are older than choices, and stronger than intentions. But I will come back. If you will have me, I will come back." Clara looked at him, at his gray eyes, which were not empty and not cold, but alive in a way that she had not seen before, the way a fire is alive when it catches, the moment between the match and the flame, the moment when dead wood remembers that it can burn. "I will have you," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a woman who has thought about it for 5 months and 9 days and 25 minutes of standing at a garden door, and who has arrived at a conclusion that is not conditional and not negotiable and not subject to revision. Edward looked at her. She looked at him. The garden held them. The wall stood behind them, old and patched and stubborn. They walked back to the house. At the garden door, Edward stopped. He did not release her arm. He turned to face her, and they were close, closer than they had been since the staircase, close enough that she could see the individual fibers of his collar and the faint scar on his jaw where the razor had slipped, and the color of his eyes in the afternoon light, which was not gray, she realized, not truly gray, but the color of the sky just before the clouds break and the blue comes through, a gray that is waiting to become something else. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For the notes, for the walks, for the humming, for the soup in the kitchen and the book you read in 3 nights, and the rosemary that does not care whether anyone is watching." He paused. "For being brave." Clara smiled. It was not a careful smile, or a polite smile, or the kind of smile that people produce for social purposes. It was the smile of a woman who has been carrying something heavy and has finally been told that she can put it down. "I am not brave," she said. "I am clumsy and loud, and I break things, and I hum off key, and I have been fired from 2 positions, and I told a duke that he needed his hearing examined." "That is what bravery looks like," Edward said. "It does not look like armor. It looks like a woman standing at a garden door in the cold, waiting for 25 minutes, refusing to leave." He released her arm. He went inside. Clara stood at the door for a moment, feeling the cold air on her face and the fading warmth of his arm under her hand. She went downstairs. She sat in the kitchen. Mrs. Geddes was preparing supper, moving between the range and the table with the practiced efficiency of a woman who could cook a 5-course meal blindfolded and frequently seemed to be attempting it. "Tea?" Mrs. Geddes said, without looking up. "Please." The tea was hot. The kitchen was warm. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread filled the air, and Clara sat at the table and drank her tea, and felt, for the first time in 9 days, that the silence was over. She went to her room that evening and opened the tin box and added the newest notes to the collection. The box was getting full. The notes were packed tight, layered, a small, dense history of 5 months and 10 days. She closed the box and put it back under her pillow, and lay down and stared at the ceiling map. "He came back," she whispered to the cracks in the plaster. "He came back." The house creaked. The wind pressed. The frost began to form on the window. Clara closed her eyes and hummed, softly, under her breath. Barbara Allen, the song about the woman who dies of grief and the man who dies of love. The terrible, manipulative, morbid song with the pretty melody and the tragic ending. She hummed it through once. Then she stopped. She needed a new song, something less fatalistic, something that did not end in death and regret and the mutual destruction of 2 people who could not figure out how to be honest with each other until it was too late. She did not know any other songs. Barbara Allen was the only one her father had taught her, and her father was dead, and the song was all she had left of his voice. But she would learn a new one. She would ask someone, Mrs. Geddes maybe, or Polly, who was 15 and knew all the popular ballads. She would learn a song that did not end in a graveyard. A song about spring, maybe. About crocuses. About things that push through the frozen ground and reach for the light. She would learn it, and she would hum it in the corridors, and the sound would travel through the walls and reach the study, where a man was sitting beside an oak fire, writing a note, and the note would say something that was not about grief or loss or the distance between London and Derbyshire. The note would say something about beginning. Clara fell asleep with the thought of new songs and new notes and the look in Edward's eyes when he said the word brave. She slept deeply and without dreams. In the morning, the frost on her window caught the dawn light and turned gold, and she woke to it, and it was beautiful, and she let it be beautiful without trying to make it mean anything. Some things do not need to mean anything. Some things are just gold light on a cold window, seen by a woman who is learning, day by day, note by note, walk by walk, to let the world in again. Spring came to Derbyshire, the way it always comes to Derbyshire, which is to say, reluctantly, with frequent reversals and false starts, and at least 2 snowfalls in April, that made everyone question whether winter had actually ended, or had simply gone out for a walk and come back. But it came. The crocuses gave way to daffodils, the daffodils gave way to tulips, the tulips gave way to the first green buds on the rose canes, tight and promising, holding inside them the memory of colors that had not been seen in this garden for 6 years. Edward began to attend to the estate in person. This was noticed. It was noticed by the tenant farmers, who had been dealing with Edward's solicitor for years, and who were so startled to see the Duke himself standing at the gate of Lower Farm on a Tuesday morning, that the nearest farmer, a man named Giles, who had been renting the same 60 acres since before Catherine was born, dropped his hat in a puddle and did not bother to pick it up. "Your Grace," Giles said. "Giles, the drainage in the east field, is it holding?" Giles stared at the Duke, the way you stare at a creature you believe to be extinct and have just encountered walking down the road, with shock, with awe, with the dawning realization that the world is more unpredictable than you thought. "It is holding, Your Grace. The new ditches are working well." "Good. The lower pasture needs refencing. I will send Harold with materials next week." "Very good, Your Grace." Edward nodded and walked on. Giles picked up his hat. He looked at it. He looked at the path where the Duke had gone. He put his hat back on his wet head and went inside and told his wife, who told the woman who came to do the laundry, who told the butcher's boy, who told the postmaster, who told everyone else. The Duke was back. The phrase traveled through the village and the surrounding farms with the speed of a brush fire. The Duke was back. Not back from somewhere, not back from a journey, but back in the sense that a person who has been absent from their own life has returned to it. The Duke was riding the grounds. The Duke was meeting tenants. The Duke was speaking in complete sentences. The Duke had been seen, by the stablemaster's nephew, smiling at something the stablemaster said about the twin colts, which were now yearlings, and had developed a talent for escaping their paddock. The stablemaster's nephew swore to this. He was questioned extensively by the postmaster and the butcher, and 3 of the tenant farmers, and he maintained his account without variation. The Duke had smiled. A real smile. Not large, not broad, not the grin of a man restored to full joy, but a smile. The muscles had moved, the corners of the mouth had lifted, the eyes had changed. At Ashworth Manor, the changes accumulated like snowmelt, small trickles joining to form streams, streams joining to form something that might, if left unchecked, become a river. The drawing-room fire was lit. Mrs. Phelps reported this to Harding with the measured calm of a woman reporting a miracle. The drawing-room, which had been sheeted and shut since the funeral, was open. The dust covers had been removed. The furniture was polished. The curtains were drawn back. Edward spent his evenings there now, not in the study. He read in the drawing-room by the fire, and sometimes he played the piano. Not well, not with any skill or training, but with the tentative, exploratory touch of a man who is remembering something his hands used to know. Harding heard the piano and stood in the corridor, and listened, and did not move for a long time. He had been Edward's valet for 12 years. He had dressed the man on his wedding day. He had held the man's coat while the man wept in the rain at the funeral. He had stood by while the house closed down, and the silence descended, and the man he served retreated into a place where no one could follow. Harding was not an emotional man. He was a professional. He took pride in his work, and he performed his duties with the precision and care of a man who believed that the quality of a pressed collar said something about the quality of a life. But he stood in the corridor and listened to the piano, and his eyes got bright, and his throat got tight, and he went downstairs and poured himself a measure of whiskey from the bottle he kept in his room, for occasions that warranted it. This warranted it. The notes between Edward and Clara continued, but they were different now. Lighter, less careful. They had crossed the territory of grief and loss and confession, and had arrived, blinking, on the other side, in a landscape that neither of them quite recognized. The landscape of normalcy. The landscape of two people who care about each other and are trying to figure out what that means, within the constraints of a world that was not built to accommodate what they are. Edward wrote, I attended Parliament yesterday. My solicitor nearly fainted. I spoke on a motion regarding agricultural reform. I believe I was persuasive. Several members approached me afterward and said they were pleased to see me. I did not know how to respond to being seen. It is a strange thing, being visible again. Clara wrote back, You were always visible. You were just standing very still. People mistake stillness for absence. They are not the same thing. Edward wrote, Margaret is coming for Easter. She has written 14 letters since Christmas. I believe she is preparing to be happy, which is a thing Margaret does with the intensity of a military campaign. Clara wrote, Tell her I said hello. There was a pause in the notes. A full day. Clara laid the fire and delivered the tea and dusted the shelves and waited for the reply that did not come until the following morning. I cannot tell her you said hello because she does not know you exist. That is to say, she knows that someone on the staff has had an effect on my disposition. She does not know who. She does not know about the notes or the walks or the books or the off-key humming. She knows only that something has changed, and she approves. Below this, in smaller writing, I would like her to know. I would like to introduce you, not as a maid, as the person who brought me back. Clara read this note and held it, and felt the weight of it, and knew that what he was proposing was not a social introduction. It was a declaration. Introducing a maid to a sister as the person who brought me back was not a thing that dukes did within the bounds of normal social conduct. It was a thing that a man did when he was telling his family that the rules had changed, that the categories no longer applied, that the woman in the apron with the off-key voice and the collection of folded notes was not a servant, but a person who mattered, and mattered in a way that could not be explained by position or duty or the normal architecture of an English country house. Clara wrote, I would like that. 3 words. Calm, certain. The words of a woman who has already decided and does not need to deliberate. Easter fell in the 2nd week of April. Margaret arrived in her carriage on Good Friday, with more parcels and more hope than she had ever brought before. And this time, the hope was not unused. This time the hope had somewhere to go. She found Edward in the drawing room. The drawing room, not the study, the drawing room, with the fire lit and the piano open, and the curtains pulled back, and the afternoon light coming in through windows that had been dark for 6 years. Margaret stood in the doorway and pressed her hand to her mouth, the same gesture she had made at Christmas when she found him in the library, and the tears came, and she let them come, because Margaret had earned these tears. She had earned them through 6 years of quarterly visits and unanswered letters, and the stubborn, unrelenting insistence that her brother was still in there somewhere, and would come out when he was ready. He was ready. Edward, she said. Margaret, come in. There is someone I would like you to meet. Margaret entered the drawing room. She saw the fire. She saw the piano. She saw her brother, standing by the window, wearing a new suit, with his hair cut and his face shaved, and his eyes clear. The gray of his eyes was not the gray of a closed window, or a pulled curtain, or a room without light. The gray was the color of the sky just after dawn, when the blue has not yet arrived but you can feel it coming, a lightness at the edges, a promise. Edward turned to the door behind Margaret. Clara stood in the doorway. She was not wearing her apron. She was wearing a dress, a simple cotton dress, blue, borrowed from Mrs. Geddes, who was wider than Clara, and whose dress therefore hung on Clara's frame in a way that made her look even smaller and younger than she was. Her hair was pinned, her hands were clasped in front of her. Her face was the face of a woman who is about to do something she has never done before and is determined to do it well. Margaret. This is Clara Byrne, Edward said. She is the reason I am standing in this room. Margaret looked at Clara. Clara looked at Margaret. There was a moment, a single beat of silence, during which Margaret assessed, and Clara endured, and Edward held his breath. Then Margaret crossed the room, and took Clara's hands in hers, and said, "Thank you." 2 words. The same 2 words that Edward had used at the garden door. But from Margaret, they carried a different weight. From Margaret, they carried 6 years of waiting and hoping, and visiting, and leaving in tears, and writing letters that were never answered, and refusing, absolutely refusing, to give up on her brother. "You are welcome," Clara said. Margaret squeezed her hands. Clara squeezed back, and that was enough. It was enough, because some things do not need to be explained, or negotiated, or discussed. Some things are understood in the grip of 2 hands, and the meeting of 2 pairs of eyes, and the shared knowledge that the man standing by the window is alive. And being alive is not the default state that everyone assumes it to be. And being alive requires effort, and courage, and a reason. And the reason is standing in a borrowed blue dress with her hair pinned, and her heart beating so hard she can feel it in her wrists. Easter dinner was served in the dining room. Mrs. Geddes made a lamb and a trifle and a bread sauce that Arthur described, with characteristic understatement, as adequate, which from Arthur meant transcendent. The candelabras were lit, the china was out, the table was set for 3. 3, not 2. Not 1. 3. Clara sat at the table. She sat at the table with the Duke of Granville and his sister, Lady Margaret, and she ate roast lamb and drank wine, and talked about books and gardens and the twin colts, and the drainage in the east fields, and the rosemary that does not care whether anyone is watching. Edward sat at the head of the table and listened. He listened to Clara tell Margaret about Barbara Allen, and the off-key humming, and the notes left on desks, and the walks through the garden in January, when the frost was so thick you could hear it crack under your feet. He listened to Margaret laugh, a real laugh, full and warm and without the careful restraint that had characterized her laughter for 6 years. The laughter of a woman who has been laughing quietly, so as not to disturb the silence, and can now, finally, let the sound out. He listened, and he watched, and his face did something that it had not done in 6 years. Not the muscle memory of a smile, not the beginning of one, not the readiness for one. A smile. Real, complete. The kind of smile that changes the geography of a face, that lifts the muscles and softens the lines, and brings light to the eyes, in a way that makes you realize the eyes were never truly gray, were never truly cold, were always waiting, always holding the possibility of this warmth, this light, this moment. Margaret saw it. She stopped mid-sentence. She put down her glass. Her own eyes filled, and she blinked, and she looked at Clara, and Clara looked at her, and they shared a glance that contained more information than any note Edward had ever written. "He is back," the glance said. "He is here, he is smiling." The candles burned, the lamb was carved, the wine was poured, the conversation continued, and Edward smiled, and Margaret cried, and Clara laughed, and the house held them all, and the house was warm. After dinner, Margaret retired to her room. Clara stood in the corridor outside the drawing room, uncertain, the way you are uncertain at the end of a significant day, when the day has been so full that you cannot believe it is the same day that began this morning, and you do not know how to let it go. Edward came out of the drawing room. He saw her in the corridor. They stood there, 3 feet apart, in the space between the drawing room and the staircase, in the space between everything they had been and everything they were becoming. "You smiled," Clara said. "I did. It suits you." He looked at her. The gray-blue eyes, the sky before dawn eyes, the eyes that had been empty and cold, and sealed shut, and were now open in a way that made Clara's breath catch. Because being looked at by someone who is truly seeing you is the most intimate thing a person can experience. More intimate than touch, more intimate than words. The simple, devastating act of being seen. "You are humming again," he said. "I am. Still off-key. Always off-key." "Perhaps," he said, and his voice was different now, lower, warmer, the voice of a man who has come back from a very long way away, and is still getting used to the sound of his own words. perhaps you might learn a second song. Something less fatalistic. Clara stared at him. He stared at her. And then something happened that the walls of Ashworth Manor had not witnessed in 6 years, and had perhaps stopped hoping to witness. Clara laughed, and Edward smiled. And the sounds met in the corridor, and traveled through the walls and the floors and the ceilings, and reached every corner of the house. From the kitchen where Mrs. Geddes was washing up, to the attic where Polly was reading fairy tales by candlelight, to the servants' hall, where Harding was sitting with his whiskey, and his pocket watch, and his quiet, unshakable loyalty. The sounds traveled through the house, and the house received them, the way old houses receive sound, with the grateful resonance of a structure that was built for living, and has been waiting, patiently, for the living to resume. Clara went to her room. She sat on her bed. She opened the tin box and took out every note and laid them on the blanket and looked at them and did not read them because she did not need to. She knew them by heart. Every word, every sentence, every period, pressed heavy into the paper. Every question mark, every line of handwriting that had started small and careful and had grown, over 5 months, larger and braver and less afraid of taking up space. She gathered the notes and put them back in the box and closed the lid and held the box in her lap and looked at the window, where the April night was dark and the frost was gone and the air smelled of wet earth and growing things. She was a maid. He was a duke. The distance between them was measured in centuries and would be measured in centuries for a long time to come. There would be conversations to be had and decisions to be made and social consequences to be endured and judgments to be weathered. There would be people who did not understand, and people who disapproved, and people who said it was impossible. But impossible was not a word that Clara Byrne put much stock in. Impossible was the word people used when they had run out of imagination. Impossible was what the crocuses would be called if crocuses listened to weather forecasts. Impossible was what the rosemary would be if rosemary cared about the odds. Clara put the box under her pillow. She lay down. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would lay the fire. Oak. Always oak. She would dust the shelves and polish the desk, and deliver the tea tray with 1 cup and 1 saucer, and 1 pot, and 1 sugar and milk. She would write a note and leave it on the desk beside the glass paperweight, and the note would say something ordinary, something about a book or a garden or the weather, and the ordinariness would be the point, because ordinary is what life is made of, and life was what they were doing now. Living, not enduring, not surviving, not continuing because the mechanics of breathing and eating do not require consent. Living, choosing, reaching for something every day, and finding it there. Outside, the Derbyshire hills lay dark under the April sky, and the garden slept in the earth, and the roses waited on the south wall, and the rosemary stood green and pungent and alive, and the house stood on its 600 acres, stone and ivy and oak fires and polished silver, and the accumulated weight of centuries, and inside the house a man who had not smiled in 6 years was sitting in a drawing room beside a fire that a woman had laid for him, and he was smiling still. Not a large smile, not the grin of a man who has forgotten his grief. The grief was there. It would always be there. It lived in a drawer in his desk, and in a green chair in the library, and in a garden planted by hands that were gone. But the grief was not alone anymore. It shared the house with something else now. Something that had arrived in October, in a cart that smelled of turnips. Something that had broken a porcelain shepherdess on its first day, and collided with a duke on a staircase, and written impertinent notes, and hummed off-key, and refused, absolutely and magnificently refused, to be silent. The fire burned low, the coals glowed, the house settled. And somewhere in the attic, under a thin pillow on a narrow bed, in a tin box that once held throat lozenges, the notes rested. All of them. Every question and every answer and every confession and every small, hard-won truth. The record of 2 people who had found each other in the silence and had decided, 1 word at a time, 1 note at a time, 1 walk at a time, to make sound again. The record was not complete. It would never be complete, because tomorrow there would be another note, and the day after another, and the day after that another, and the story of Clara and Edward was not a story with an ending. It was a story with a direction. Forward, always forward. through the grief and the joy, and the anger and the tenderness, and the off-key humming, and the oak fires, and the crocuses that do not wait for permission. Forward, into the spring, into the life that was waiting for them, into the sound